There is a moment, right at the start of every single episode of The Simpsons, that almost nobody has ever truly watched. Not in the way it deserves to be watched. Not with the kind of attention that would make it give up what it is actually doing beneath its surface. The opening of any long-running television show tends to become invisible over time, something the brain registers as the signal that the thing you want is about to begin, and then filters out before it is actually finished. The couch, the characters, the theme music, the 32 seconds of animation, after a certain number of viewings, all of it collapses into a single sensation. This is The Simpsons. It is starting. And then the show starts. And the opening is already forgotten. But here is what that opening sequence actually is, when you give it the kind of attention it has always quietly deserved. It is a text. A complete compressed document of everything the show is doing and has always been doing, written in a language made of background details, color relationships, musical choices, and freeze-frame content that is invisible in normal viewing. The opening of The Simpsons contains more deliberately placed hidden information than almost any other 30 seconds in the history of animated television. And it has been accumulating that hidden information for 36 years, quietly, episode by episode, in a place where the vast majority of viewers never think to look. The sequence is not the same twice. That is the first thing worth understanding. Most viewers have formed the impression that the opening is fixed the same images in the same order every week. It is not. The length changes. The chalkboard sentence changes. The saxophone riff changes. The couch gag changes. The geography visible in the aerial establishing shot changes. The items in Marge's shopping cart change. The license plates in the nuclear plant parking lot change. The objects on Homer's workstation change. The specific content on the classroom walls changes. The show has been making a different opening sequence every single week for 36 years and presenting it in a format that reads at normal viewing speed as a single repeating image. Which means 36 years of unique opening sequences exist. 36 years of small, specific, discoverable content placed in a slot where nobody looks closely enough to find it. Let us start with the title card itself. When the name The Simpsons appears on screen, the letters are yellow. Always the same yellow. The same warm, slightly golden yellow that covers every member of the Simpson family and most of the residents of Springfield. Within the internal logic of the show, this is not coincidence and not merely brand consistency. The show's name and its characters are made of the same material. The title belongs to the family in a literal visual sense. When you see those yellow letters, you are seeing them rendered in the color of the people they belong to. The word and the people it names share a single color. They are continuous with each other. The animators have confirmed in interviews and DVD commentary tracks across the years that the color relationships in the opening sequence were deliberate down to specific shades. The yellow of the title matches the yellow of the family. The blue of the sky matches the blue of Springfield Elementary's exterior in its most commonly seen daylight rendering. The orange of Bart's shirt coordinates with the warm tones of the sky at the particular angle the opening shot uses. This is a color language, established at the beginning of the show's history, saying in visual terms what the show believes about its own world, that in Springfield, everything is connected to everything else. The title and the characters, the school and the sky, the boy and the color his world is made of. This becomes interesting in a specific way when you consider how many of the show's deepest running themes concern people who cannot see how interconnected their world actually is. The residents of Springfield exist inside a web of causes and effects that are all traceable back to the same few sources, and they cannot find the thread. The opening sequence before a single character has appeared has already told you that everything here belongs to the same thing. The color of the name is the color of the family. The thread is visible from the beginning. Now, the clouds. In the very first shot of the opening, before any character is visible, you are looking at clouds. Just clouds, moving gently, the camera drifting through them in a way that always feels slightly dreamlike. Most viewers register this as a generic establishing shot. We are outdoors, we are above a town, the camera is descending. But the clouds in this opening shot are not quite like clouds in other animated shows. Cartoon clouds tend to be round and puffy and entirely benign, the visual shorthand for pleasant weather and a safe, immediately readable environment. The Simpsons' opening clouds are softer than that. Their edges blur. They shift in ways that suggest they might be moving independently of each other. They catch the light with more consideration than a 2-second establishing shot typically receives. In certain episodes, particularly in the earlier seasons before the opening sequence was fully standardized and the animation style had settled into its long-term form, the shapes in those clouds have drawn attention from viewers who look at them carefully. Not faces, exactly, not clearly placed symbols, not anything you could point to and say, here, a deliberate image was placed here. This was intentional. But the particular kind of attention the brain brings to cloud formations, the same attention that finds horses and faces and ships in the patterns of real clouds, finds suggestions in the early openings clouds that the standard round cartoony alternative would not produce. Something that might be a profile, something that might be an expression, something that catches and holds the eye for a moment before the camera continues its descent and the moment passes. Whether this was deliberate or simply the result of careful cloud rendering producing ambiguous organic shapes is something the production has never addressed publicly. The show's 36-year history of hiding choices inside things that look like nothing makes the question worth holding open, even without a definitive answer. The sequence continues, and the aerial establishing shot of Springfield is where the first clearly documentable Easter egg tradition begins, the tradition of the variable geography. As the camera sweeps down toward the town, you can see Springfield laid out below for a fraction of a second. The general shape of the town is consistent across episodes. The nuclear plant is visible with its distinctive cooling towers. The downtown district is in its usual position. The residential streets extend in the same rough pattern outward from the center. But the geography surrounding the town changes. Sometimes mountains are visible in the distance. Sometimes the distant horizon is flat in every direction. Sometimes the light on the horizon suggests water. Sometimes Springfield is obviously landlocked. Sometimes there are forests extending to the edges of the frame. Sometimes there are not. The implied climate shifts. The density of whatever surrounds Springfield shifts. The show is changing the geography of its own establishing shot deliberately as a running visual argument about its lifelong refusal to commit Springfield to any specific location. Each aerial view shows a slightly different town, the same name, the same rough structure, the surrounding world quietly rearranged, so that no single episode contradicts any other episode about what state or region Springfield occupies. They simply all contradict each other, and that collective contradiction is the point. The joke is in the impossibility, maintained at the scale of the aerial establishing shot. There are fans who have cataloged these aerial views across the show's run, noting which episodes show mountains and which show water and which show plains, trying to find a consistent pattern that would narrow Springfield's location. The pattern has not emerged. The geography does not converge. Springfield remains, as seen from above, a different town every week. The camera comes to street level, and the Easter eggs begin accumulating in earnest. At Springfield Elementary, the classroom sequence gives the viewer a few seconds of context before Bart escapes through the window. The chalkboard sentence he is writing will get its own extended section later. But the classroom as a physical space rewards examination beyond the chalkboard. The desks in the room do not match each other. Different sizes, different styles, some with attached chairs and some without, some with visible wear that others lack. This looks like simple background variety, and in one sense it is. In another sense, it precisely mirrors the appearance of real underfunded public school classrooms, where budget constraints over years produce exactly this kind of accumulated mismatching desks purchased at different times from different sources, furniture that arrived as donations, equipment that simply persisted because there was no money to replace it with something consistent. The background of a cartoon classroom makes a visual argument about public school funding in 2 seconds of establishing shot, available to the viewer whose eye settles on the furniture rather than following Bart. On the classroom walls, visible for a fraction of a second as the sequence moves through the space, are the things that get pinned on elementary school walls. Children's drawings, written assignments, seasonal decorations, posters with educational content. And in various episodes, freeze-framing these walls has produced specific discoverable content drawings that appear to reference events from earlier in the show's run, crude child-scale renderings of things that belong to Springfield's specific history. A drawing that might be Blinky, the three-eyed fish, executed in the thick crayon lines of a young child's art project. A finger painting whose color palette and general shapes suggest the nuclear plant's cooling towers as a child would render them. A written assignment whose content, visible in freeze frame if not in real time, references something that happened in the town in a previous episode. These images are available for 1/2 second at most before the sequence moves on. They are there for the viewer who looks. The teacher in this shot is worth considering as a case study in how the opening sequence was allowed to quietly evolve. In the earliest episodes, she is a generic background figure, a woman at the front of a classroom, performing the role of teacher without being anyone specific. Gradually, across the first several seasons, she became specifically Mrs. Krabappel, Edna Krabappel, voiced by Marcia Wallace, one of the show's most beloved and most complicated secondary characters. The transition from generic teacher to Edna Krabappel happened without announcement, without any episode calling attention to it, without the credits being changed to acknowledge it. The opening sequence simply updated itself as the character accumulated weight and identity and importance to the show's world. One week, the classroom background teacher was nobody. Eventually, she was someone. The line between those two states was crossed somewhere in the show's early run, and nobody marked the moment. After Mrs. Krabappel's classroom, Lisa walks down the school hallway playing saxophone. This is a 4-second shot, and the saxophone riff Lisa plays in those 4 seconds is different in every single episode. This is not an approximation or a rough characterization. It is precisely true. Every episode of The Simpsons features a unique, original, never-repeated 4-second saxophone melody played by Lisa Simpson in the school hallway during the opening credits. This was confirmed by members of the music production team and has been discussed in interviews with Yeardley Smith, who voices Lisa. Someone on the production for 36 years, across nearly 800 episodes, has composed a specific piece of music for a 4-second shot that almost no viewer will consciously register as unique. The riff changes from one week to the next, and the audience, by and large, does not notice. It just sounds like Lisa playing saxophone in the hallway, which is what it is. The uniqueness is invisible at normal attention levels. This is the philosophy of the show's entire hidden content practice compressed into a single recurring creative commitment. The riff nobody will consciously identify as unique is still unique. The 4 seconds nobody will clock as specifically composed are still specifically composed. The care goes into the corner nobody examines, maintained at the same standard as the parts everyone watches. The reason to do this is not that the audience will notice. The reason is that the production treats every corner of its show as worth the care. The jazz riff in the hallway is the flag planted for that principle. The hallway itself contains numbered lockers, visible as Lisa walks past them. Those numbers have been found, in multiple episodes, to correspond to production codes, the internal reference numbers used by the studio to organize and track episodes through the production pipeline. Locker numbers as episode identifiers, a filing system embedded in a school hallway background. Visible to anyone who knows what a Simpsons production code looks like, invisible to anyone who does not. Both categories of viewers see a hallway with lockers. Only one category of viewers sees a hallway with lockers and a library catalog. Marge at the grocery store is a shot that receives even less focused attention than the school sequences. The eye follows Marge. The shelves behind her exist as environmental context. Most viewers have processed this shot thousands of times without examining what is on those shelves. The labeled products on the shelves behind Marge are not placeholder text. In the earliest seasons, they carried straightforward pun-based brand names, jokes that would land in 0 seconds if a viewer happened to read them, but that nobody was required to read. As the show developed, the grocery store shelves became a running repository for more specific content. References to things the writing staff were thinking about in a given production period. Names of crew members appearing on product labels. Connections between specific products and the episode. The shot belongs to a product whose name or label text comments on the episode's themes in a way that required someone to know both the product and the episode to place the label correctly. The grocery store is a weekly bulletin board for the production staff, stocked behind Marge as she pushes her cart through a shot lasting approximately 2 seconds. Marge's cart also varies. In specific episodes, what is visible in the cart includes things that appear later in the episode, something on the kitchen table in a family dinner scene that was visible in the cart during the opening, maintaining the mundane logic of a grocery trip in the silent background of a 2-second credit shot. The cart contents as foreshadowing in domestic miniature. Homer's moment at the nuclear plant is brief and physical. He grabs the glowing rod, shoves it down his shirt, the rod glows through his pocket. But the plant environment around him during these seconds is detailed. His workstation has specific objects. Those objects change between episodes, and in documented cases, the photographs visible on his workstation show tiny versions of scenes from earlier in the show's history, images too small to identify at normal viewing speed that reveal their content only in freeze frame. The parking lot visible through the plant's exterior in some versions of the opening sequence has cars with license plates, and those plates, when examined, carry production information encoded in their numbers. The 5 seconds of Homer at the plant is an archive. Most viewers see a man put a glowing thing in his shirt. The archive is available beneath that for anyone who goes looking. The drive home through Springfield streets is another tradition the opening maintains. Houses on the approach to Evergreen Terrace are not blank architectural stand-ins. They have mailboxes with names. They have curtained windows. They have yards that sometimes contain things. And in documented cases, the yards contain specific objects belonging to specific background characters from the show's history: a toy, a piece of outdoor furniture, a vehicle that appeared in a scene from an episode in an earlier season and that persists in the background of the street across subsequent episodes. The street remembers its residents the way a real street does, through the objects people leave outside their houses. Nobody required this. Nobody would have noticed its absence. It is there because the people who made this show treat the background of a 2-second drive-home shot as worth maintaining correctly. The sky across the entire opening sequence, across all the transitions between locations, the school and the grocery store, and the plant and the street, is not a consistent quality of light. The classroom scene suggests late morning. The grocery store suggests late afternoon. The plant suggests midday, the particular bright overhead quality of direct noon sun. The street approach to the house suggests early evening. All of these are happening simultaneously in the opening's logic, the whole family completing their separate activities at the same moment. But the light tells a different story. A story where multiple times of day are occurring simultaneously in the same continuous sequence. Springfield is a town where time does not work correctly. The children never age. The catastrophes reset between episodes. The history of the place rewrites itself to fit the present. And the opening sequence, if you are watching the sky rather than the action, shows time failing to work correctly in its very first 30 seconds. A morning and an afternoon and an evening all folded into the same 30-second commute home. The show announces its temporal impossibility in the quality of light in its opening credits, and then it moves on before anyone can ask about it. The cumulative picture is this. The opening of The Simpsons is not a fixed thing. It is a living document that has been updated, accumulated, and maintained across 36 years. It contains specific information invisible at normal viewing speed. It encodes production history and background details. It composes unique music for shots that nobody will consciously register as unique. It places specific content in shelves and parking lots and school hallways for the viewer who chooses to look at the background instead of the foreground. It tells, in its quality of light, a story about time not working that none of its characters can articulate. And it does all of this in 30 seconds that the audience has long since filed away as the thing that plays before the show starts. Once you have seen it as what it actually is, the opening can never just be the opening again. If you are watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, and whatever time it happens to be, drop your location and time in the comments. There is something genuinely nice about knowing people in different places and different time zones are in the same quiet space at the same time. And if you want to keep going deeper into Springfield, make sure you are subscribed. There is considerably more to find. Section 2. The Couch Gag's A Secret Diary of the Show's Soul. The couch gag is, on the surface, the silliest part of The Simpsons. Every episode ends its opening credits with the same sequence. The Simpson family races home from wherever they have been in the credit sequence. They burst through the front door, they sprint down the hallway past the framed family photographs, and they pile onto the couch in the living room. And then something happens. Something happens to them on the couch, or something happens to the couch itself, or something happens to the room the couch is in, or the entire premise of a family arriving home to sit together is subverted in a new and specific way. The credits end. The episode begins. This was, at its origin, a practical solution to a production problem. Not every episode of The Simpsons runs to exactly the same length. Some episodes are a few seconds shorter than the broadcast slot requires, and some are a few seconds longer, and in either case the opening credits need to adjust to fill or accommodate the available time. The couch gag was elastic by design. A longer gag filled more time. A shorter gag compressed. The sequence could stretch or shrink to fit the episode, and the variation from week to week was the mechanism that made this work. A clever piece of broadcast engineering wearing the costume of a recurring joke. What happened to the couch gag over the following 36 years is one of the more quietly remarkable creative evolutions in American television, and it is one that rarely gets discussed in those terms because the couch gag slot is not where anyone expects remarkable things to happen. It is the silly bit. The quick gag before the real show. The part where you go to the kitchen to get a drink and come back to the couch to find your family already settled. The gags grew, slowly at first, then, with increasing ambition, they became more elaborate. They started telling micro-stories with setups and escalations and resolutions rather than delivering single punchlines. By the 2010s, couch gags were being directed by guest animators working in entirely different visual languages. The street artist Banksy created one that turned the couch gag slot into a political statement about the animation industry's labor conditions, depicting a grim overseas factory producing Simpsons merchandise and animation cells, while a unicorn is used as a hole punch and a dolphin is used to seal boxes. The experimental animator Don Hertzfeldt created one set in a far future where the show has been running for centuries, and the characters have degraded into barely recognizable shapes that gesture toward humanity without quite achieving it. Other guest directors brought visual idioms entirely foreign to The Simpsons' usual style, using the couch gag as a 3 to 4 minute short film with its own internal logic and emotional register. One couch gag ran for nearly 4 minutes. It is, for those 4 minutes, a completely different kind of animated content than the show surrounding it, and because it lives in the couch gag slot, a position everyone has categorized as the playful filler before the episode begins, it has the structural freedom that position provides. Nobody is expecting significance in the couch gag. Nobody is primed to look for it. The couch gag became the most experimentally free creative space in the show's format because the format itself designates it as inconsequential, and the production used that designation as permission to do things that would not survive scrutiny if they appeared in the main show. The Easter eggs in the couch gag tradition are best understood across 3 distinct categories, each of which requires different knowledge and a different kind of attention. The first category is the living room environment. The couch exists in the Simpson family's living room. The living room is a space the viewer knows extremely well after hundreds of episodes. And yet the living room, as seen in the couch gag, contains things that change. The television set behind the couch, visible in many gag configurations as the family piles onto the couch and faces forward, is sometimes on. In the earliest couch gags, it showed static or a test pattern, the specific visual noise of a television between channels in an era before channels filled dead air with programming. As the show developed its habit of encoding specific content in background televisions, the living room television became a location. In a Season 4 couch gag, the television appears to be playing a clip from an episode earlier in that same season, a tiny, brief, unannounced callback visible only to the viewer who both remembered the earlier episode and noticed the television rather than watching the family arrive. The image is too small to be certain in anything but freeze frame. The connection to the earlier episode requires the viewer to have carried the visual memory of that episode forward far enough to recognize it at background scale. This is the deepest form of callback the show employs, the reference that requires both a specific memory and a specific attention to the wrong part of the screen. It asks the viewer to have watched carefully, to have retained what they watched, and to then redirect their attention away from the action and toward the background. Each of those conditions filters out most viewers. The Easter egg persists for the viewer who meets all 3. The toy chest in the corner of the Simpson living room appears in couch gag frames, where that part of the room is visible. When the chest is open and facing the camera, its contents can be examined in freeze frame. Those contents change between seasons. They include miniature versions of specific objects from that season's episodes, small props that reference things happening in the show during the period the gag was made, a tiny version of a costume Homer wore in a recent episode, a miniature object that appeared as a plot element, toys that function as a compact visual index of the season they belong to, stored in the chest in the corner of the living room during a 3-second shot. The second category is the self-commentary couch gag, the gag that uses its own format to say something about the show's situation that the show itself cannot say in its regular format. These appear across the middle seasons and become more deliberate as the show developed awareness of its own cultural position. A gag where the family arrives to find the couch cordoned off behind velvet ropes in a museum display, their own living room furniture elevated to artifact status, is funny as a sight gag about fame and cultural significance. It is also made during a period when critics and audiences were actively debating whether The Simpsons had completed its cultural relevance and become more monument than active creative force, a piece of direct self-commentary about exactly that question. The family arrives to inhabit their own image and is immediately removed by security. The gag asks whether the characters can still live inside their own world, or whether the weight of their cultural significance has displaced them from it. The joke and the argument about the show's cultural moment are the same thing. A gag where the family arrives on the couch only to find themselves in black and white, or in a different animation style entirely, or in a resolution so degraded that the characters are barely recognizable, is commenting on the show's relationship to its own production history, the past and present of its visual style, the distance between what it looked like in 1989 and what it looks like now, the question of whether the core identity of the show persists across those changes, or whether the thing called The Simpsons is a different thing at different points in its history. These gags work perfectly as jokes. They require no additional knowledge to be funny, but they carry an additional meaning for the viewer who is thinking about the show rather than just watching it. The Banksy couch gag from season 22 is the most fully developed example of this category. It is overtly political in a way the main show rarely allows itself to be. It depicts the production of Simpsons animation and merchandise as exploitative overseas labor, using imagery associated with sweatshop conditions and environmental cruelty, the dolphin, the unicorn, the caged animals in a visual register far darker than anything in the show's usual palette. For viewers watching it as a Simpsons couch gag, it is surprising and somewhat jarring. For viewers who knew Banksy's work and the political concerns that recur across it, the gag is an extension of a specific artistic practice brought into the Simpsons living room, because the couch gag slot provided the only formal space where that practice could be hosted without immediately becoming something the show was being asked to fully endorse. The couch gag as diplomatic territory, a 3-minute zone where the show could host a perspective without the show itself being entirely accountable for that perspective. Don Hertzfeldt's season 26 contribution is the most Easter egg-dense couch gag in the archive. The premise places the action in a far future, specifically the year 10,000, though this is not stated in the gag itself but has been confirmed by Hertzfeldt, where The Simpsons has been running for centuries, and the characters have undergone successive redesigns so extensive that they bear only traces of their original appearance. Homer has extra mouths. Bart is a sphere with suggestions of features. The family's movements are wrong in ways that feel biological, too slow, too fluid, as if the fundamental rules governing cartoon physics have been revised repeatedly until they barely resemble what they started as. The backgrounds of this far-future living room contain specific things. Objects visible in freeze-frame examination that are degraded versions of objects from the original living room, transformed by centuries of revision into shapes that gesture toward their origins without quite reaching them. The television behind the couch plays something. Freeze-framing that television screen has produced, in multiple examinations by multiple viewers, what appear to be scenes from extremely early Simpsons episodes season 1 and 2 content, rendered at wrong speeds and wrong resolutions, distorted as if being reconstructed from a corrupted archive. The future Simpsons is trying to remember its own past. Its reconstruction is imperfect. The earliest episodes of the show appear as ghost images on the television of a future that has nearly forgotten them. This is a couch gag about memory and degradation, and the relationship between present identity and an increasingly inaccessible past. It hides references to the show's origins inside a visual argument about how distance transforms origins into approximations. It does this in a couch gag slot, in 3.5 minutes, in a style entirely foreign to the show's regular visual language. The third category is the numerical and systemic Easter egg patterns in the couch gag archive that are not visible in any individual gag, but that emerge across multiple episodes if you watch them in sequence with attention to specific variables. The number 7 and the letter G7G. Homer's sector at the nuclear plant appears with unusual frequency in backgrounds visible during couch gag sequences. On locker numbers in gags set in school environments. On license plates glimpsed through the living room window. On labels on objects in the living room itself. Whether this is a deliberate watermark, the show embedding its most iconic internal reference into the background of its most variable sequence, or simply confirmation bias operating on a production that naturally recycles numbers from its own internal vocabulary, is genuinely uncertain. The frequency of the appearance is notable enough to have been independently identified by multiple viewers working without coordination. The number of frames in specific couch gags has been found, in documented cases, to correspond to numbers significant in the episodes those gags appear in. A gag with a specific total frame count whose number matches the episode's production code. A gag running for a length of time that encodes a date significant to the show's production history. These connections require knowledge of animation, frame rates, and production codes, and dates that most viewers do not carry, and confirming them requires frame-accurate examination tools that casual viewing does not provide. They exist in the category of Easter egg that may be real, or may be the show's long history of rewarding close examination having trained viewers to find patterns everywhere, including patterns that were not deliberately placed. The couch has been in that living room since 1989. The room around it has been hiding specific, discoverable things for the same length of time. And the way to understand the couch gag tradition is not as a separate category of the show's hidden content, but as its most concentrated expression, the place where the practice of hiding things in the least examined space reaches its fullest development. The couch gag is the silliest part of The Simpsons. It is also the place where the most ambitious and the most specifically hidden content in the show's run has accumulated. The couch is always there when the family arrives, and there has always been more in the room around it than the family knows to look for. Section 3. Background details nobody was supposed to notice. The background of a cartoon shot is, in theory, the part nobody looks at. The background establishes location. It provides context. It gives the animated characters a world to exist inside. The viewer's attention is supposed to follow the characters, track their movements, read their expressions, follow their dialogue. The background is what you pass through on the way to what matters. It is the scenery. It is the set. It is the part of the production that communicates where we are, not what is happening. The people who make The Simpsons have understood this for 36 years. They have been exploiting it for exactly as long. The backgrounds of The Simpsons are stocked with things. Specific, intentional, discoverable things. References, jokes, names, numbers. Tiny visual stories playing out in the corners of frames, while the main narrative proceeds in the center of the image. The show has built, across the course of its run, one of the most thoroughly furnished bodies of hidden content in the history of television. And it has placed almost all of it in the part of the screen that the conventions of how we watch television say you should not be looking at. This is not accidental and not incidental. It is a deliberate inversion of where hidden things are expected to be found. The hidden content is in the background precisely because the background is where nobody looks. The Easter egg placed in the center of the frame, where everyone will find it, is not really an Easter egg. It is a highlighted detail, a pointed reference, an announced callback. The background is where you can hide something for the viewer who is watching wrong, who has redirected their attention away from where the grammar of viewing says it should go, who has decided to read the room rather than follow the story. The bookshelves of Springfield are a good place to begin. Books appear throughout the show. They are on shelves in the Simpsons' home, in the school library, in characters' offices, in the background of scenes set in virtually every indoor location Springfield offers. Books are background furniture, and their spines are typically visible as colored rectangles with text on them. Not all of that text is placeholder. A significant portion of books and scenes where the camera gives the shelves any visual prominence at all carry readable titles in freeze-frame examination, and those titles are not generic stand-ins. The simplest category is the pun title, a joke constructed from a real book's title by modifying it to create a new meaning, typically connected to the scene or character the shelf belongs to. These require only enough familiarity with the original to recognize what has been changed and why. They are the first level of bookshelf Easter egg, readable in a fraction of a second to any viewer who glances at the shelf and has a passing familiarity with the parodied titles. The deeper category is the thematically precise bookshelf. In scenes where a character's emotional or intellectual situation is the episode's concern, the books visible in the background of their environment encode a compressed description of that situation. A character facing a specific kind of crisis has books on the visible shelves that describe, in their modified or parodied titles, the exact category of problem they are navigating. The shelves behind a character dealing with a specific failure contain books about failure, recovery, and the gap between ambition and outcome, the titles phrased as jokes, but the subject matter precisely matching what is happening in the foreground. The background is running a commentary on the story happening in front of it. The commentary is legible only to the viewer who is reading the background rather than watching the foreground. In one bookstore scene, visible in the background of a sequence primarily concerned with a conversation happening in the store's center, the titles on 3 shelf levels form a 3-part joke, readable left to right and top to bottom. A setup on the top shelf, an escalation on the middle shelf, a punchline on the bottom shelf. The joke is not in the dialogue. It is not referenced by any character. It exists entirely in the arrangement of fictional book titles on background shelves. The viewer who reads the shelves in sequence gets a complete joke. The viewer who watches the scene normally gets the same scene and a completely different kind of information. The two experiences of the same image are non-overlapping. The Springfield shopper appears throughout the show as a background object held by characters reading it, left on tables and counters, sitting in newspaper boxes. When it appears in background positions with its headline visible, those headlines form a running record of events in Springfield that the main story is not addressing. Things happening in the town that the episode's characters are not part of. Local politics advancing in the background while the Simpson family deals with their own situation. The community around the show's central family, continuing to have news and events documented in the background newspapers of scenes about something else. Some of those background headlines reference events from earlier episodes, outcomes of plots the show moved past, treated as ongoing news in the fictional Springfield even when the narrative has already moved on. A business that opened in an earlier episode appears in a headline about its progress or failure. A public figure introduced in a previous season appears in news context that extends their story beyond the episode that introduced them. The newspaper maintains a parallel timeline, less dramatic than the episode's central plots but continuous in a way the episodic format is not. And some of those headlines, in documented examinations by attentive viewers, appear to name or describe things that become relevant in episodes airing after the episode the headline appears in. A headline previewing something the show has not yet addressed. The background newspaper running stories about the show's future. Whether this is planning, whether the writers coordinating the newspaper backgrounds are told about upcoming episodes and asked to include relevant references, or whether it is coincidence produced by a show set in a single town where the same institutions and concerns recur naturally, the production has not confirmed. The televisions distributed throughout Springfield's domestic and public environments deserve extended consideration because they are the most consistently rewarding area of background examination in the entire show. Background televisions in The Simpsons are almost never playing arbitrary content. The programming visible on background televisions in scenes where characters are not watching, where the television is simply part of the room's furniture rather than the focus of anyone's attention, tracks the emotional and thematic content of the scene it appears in. This requires evidence, so consider specific categories. An episode whose central concern is jealousy and comparison, the feeling of measuring yourself against someone else's success, has background televisions throughout the episode, playing programming related to competition, game shows, sports coverage, nature documentaries focusing on territorial behavior and dominance contests. An episode structured around questions of authority and who has the right to make decisions has background televisions showing political coverage, courtroom programming, and documentary content about hierarchical institutions. An episode about grief and memory has background televisions playing older programming things that look like content from a previous era, visually dated in their production quality even when the image is too small to identify specific programs. None of the characters in these scenes are watching the televisions. None of them comment on what the televisions are playing. The programming exists in the background for the viewer who is watching the background, providing a second track of thematic information that runs parallel to the main story's emotional content without ever intersecting with it in a way any character acknowledges. The consistency of this pattern across the show's run is significant enough to suggest a systematic practice rather than occasional coincidence. Someone making decisions about what background televisions play in any given scene is either consciously matching that content to the episode's themes or is so saturated in those themes during production that the content choices reflect them unconsciously. In either case, the televisions carry information about the episodes they appear in that the episode's foregrounds do not deliver. The Krusty Burger menu board is one of the show's most quietly persistent running jokes, existing almost entirely in the background. Krusty Burger scenes are common. The restaurant is a recurring Springfield institution. In those scenes, the menu board behind the counter is visible, with varying degrees of clarity depending on the shot. That menu board lists items with prices and calorie counts. Those numbers change between episodes. The calorie counts go up, the prices go up. The direction is always the same, and the change always happens without comment from any character, because no character is tracking the menu board across decades of the show's run. The cumulative price increase visible across the Krusty Burger menu board, if you have somehow tracked every Krusty Burger scene in sequence, is staggering, a 30-year record of food price inflation, documented in the background of a cartoon restaurant, perfectly consistent with actual fast food price trajectories over the same period, but never discussed or acknowledged by anyone in the show's world. The background is making an economic observation in the only way a background can make an observation: silently, persistently, available only to the viewer who thought to look and remembers what they saw. The Quickie Mart's shelves are a somewhat different case. The shelves behind Apu's register are the most frequently visible commercial environment in the show, and they have been examined by fans more thoroughly than almost any other background space. Products, prices, Apu's personal items, all of it has been studied. One product in particular has attracted sustained attention. In the top left corner of the shelf closest to the register, there is a small product that appears in an unusually large number of quick E-Mart scenes across the show's run. It is always in approximately the same position. It has a label. The label is too small to read with confidence in most available resolutions of the show. The product has never been identified with certainty by any viewer or confirmed by the production. It simply persists, from the earliest Quickie Mart scenes through recent episodes, in its corner of the background. The simplest explanation is that it is a product design that the background artists found pleasing or convenient and continued reusing across the show's run without any specific intent. The explanation, consistent with how everything else in this background works, is that someone knows what that product is and what its label says, and it has been maintained deliberately in the same corner of the same shelf for 3 decades because removing it would be more conspicuous than leaving it. The product is a small, permanent fixture of a background that almost nobody examines, persisting in the show's visual texture for reasons that may or may not be anything more than habit. Springfield General Hospital's walls contain, in scenes set in its examination rooms and waiting areas, what appear to be anatomical diagrams and medical information posters. The diagrams are, when they can be examined closely enough, sufficiently accurate to plausibly derive from actual medical reference material. The proportions are correct. The structures named are correctly named. The informational content on the posters describes conditions and procedures with more clinical accuracy than a cartoon background typically provides. Someone involved in background design for the hospital's environment at some point chose to use real medical illustration references rather than inventing cartoon versions of medical charts. The accuracy of the resulting walls is invisible to viewers without medical training. It reads as generic hospital background. For viewers with medical training who happen to pause on a hospital scene and examine the walls, the hospital is providing information that is actually correct. The cartoon hospital has real anatomy on its walls. This is the show's hidden content practice at its most invisible. Content placed for an audience so small, people who both watch The Simpsons and have the specialized knowledge to verify medical illustration accuracy, that it borders on content with no practical audience at all, made correctly because making it correctly was the only option the background artist considered. Springfield Elementary's trophy case, visible in background shots of the school hallway, contains trophies with inscriptions. The inscriptions name specific recipients and specific achievements. Some of those names belong to background characters from across the show's history, the school's fictional, athletic, and academic past encoded in the trophy case's contents. Some names are recognizable to anyone who has worked on the show's production crew members, writers, directors, whose names appear on fictional school trophies in a fictional school hallway, honored in a background detail that most viewers will pass by at speed without reading. Some trophy dates connect to specific episodes from earlier seasons, placing specific fictional achievements in the show's timeline. The trophy case is a small 3-dimensional archive, maintained in a background that nobody outside the fan community examines carefully. It has been accumulating content since early in the show's run. Its complete contents have not been publicly cataloged. The cemetery is one of Springfield's most semantically rich background environments, and it is worth dwelling there for a moment because the cemetery is where the show's relationship to its own history gets treated most seriously. Background gravestones have text on them. Some of the inscriptions are jokes, the kinds of epitaphs that produce a quiet smile if you read them. Some connect specifically to the show's world, belonging to characters who have died in the narrative or to institutions that existed and ended in the town's history. Some name characters who have never appeared in any episode names that belong to no established figure in the canon, carrying dates and brief inscriptions and nothing else. These unnamed grave inhabitants suggest that Springfield has a history older and more specific than any episode has needed to address. They imply lives lived in this town before The Simpsons arrived, or between episodes, or in the spaces the show has not visited. The cemetery background is populated with people the show has never told us about, documented in their permanent location in the most permanent part of the town's landscape. One grave in particular appears in backgrounds across multiple cemetery set scenes across different seasons. It belongs to a character who shares a surname with a living Springfield resident but is clearly a different person. The date's wrong for the living character, the given name different, the inscription not matching anything the living character's story involves. The relationship between this grave and the living character who shares its name has never been addressed in any episode. The grave continues to appear in its position in the background every time the cemetery appears. Whatever the connection between the grave's inhabitant and their living namesake is, if there is any connection at all, the show has chosen not to tell it. The grave simply persists, available to be found, belonging to a story the show has never told. Section 4. The Chalkboard Confessions. There is a ritual at the beginning of every Simpsons episode. Bart Simpson stands at a chalkboard and writes the same sentence over and over, filling the board with lines of identical text, as punishment for something he has done or said or been accused of. The camera holds on him partway through this task. He writes. The bell rings. He drops the chalk and runs. And the opening sequence continues. The chalkboard gag is the most legible text in the opening sequence. Unlike the fine print on billboards, the labels on grocery shelves, the locker numbers encoding production codes, the inscriptions on trophy cases, all of which require freeze-frame examination and specific knowledge to read the chalkboard sentence, is designed to be read in real time. The camera lingers. The sentence is large enough to be visible at normal viewing size. It repeats enough times on the board to give the viewer multiple passes at it. You are supposed to read the chalkboard. The chalkboard is one of the few parts of the opening where the hidden content is hidden in plain sight, rather than in the background. And yet the chalkboard, taken as a whole, as a running document maintained across 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes, has rarely been examined as what it actually is. Not a series of individual gags, each funny in its own week and then replaced by the next one. A continuous record. A weekly entry in a diary that the show has been keeping for 36 years, tracking what the production was thinking about and responding to, and finding important enough to encode in the most visible 2 inches of its opening credits. Consider what the chalkboard actually is as a format. It is a punishment. Bart is being made to write the same sentence repeatedly because he did something wrong. The sentence names or describes the wrong, and the punishment is performative, it is public, witnessed, meant to produce shame or at least acknowledgement of the transgression before the community represented by the school. The chalkboard gag was built on this structure and then immediately began subverting it. The sentences are too funny to produce shame. They are too specific and too well constructed to read as genuine punishment. They read as Bart's commentary on his own transgression, framed in the genre of punishment but carrying the register of performance. Bart is not remorseful. Bart is amused. The chalkboard sentence is what Bart thinks about the thing he did, wearing the costume of what he is required to say about it. In the earliest seasons, the sentences were simple character establishment. They told you who Bart was by showing you what he got in trouble for. I will not skateboard in the halls. I will not burp in class. I did not invent the steamboat. The offenses are Bart-scaled and Bart-specific. They establish a particular kind of boy, physical, disruptive, rule-resistant, cheerfully unrepentant. The chalkboard was doing what an establishing element is supposed to do, establishing. Within 2 seasons, the sentences began doing more than that. The topical chalkboard sentence appeared early and has remained consistent throughout the show's run. These sentences require awareness of something happening outside Springfield in the news, in culture, in the show's own cultural environment to fully read. I did not see Elvis. I am not a 32-year-old woman. These sentences still function as BART sentences, still deliver the quick joke, but they also assume that the viewer is bringing a specific cultural context. They reward contextual knowledge. They exist at the intersection of the show and the world the show is set in. As the show developed through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the topical sentences became more precisely timed. A chalkboard sentence appearing in an episode that aired during a specific news cycle responds to that news cycle with a precision that requires knowing when the episode aired to fully appreciate. The speed at which current events could be addressed in the chalkboard gag, which was often among the last production decisions made before an episode was finalized, gave the chalkboard a kind of responsiveness unusual in television. Chalkboard sentences from specific weeks of specific years are documents of the cultural moment they were written in, compressed into a single sentence in Bart Simpson's handwriting. The callback category is perhaps the most rewarding for attentive long-term viewers. These are sentences that reference specific moments from earlier episodes, framed as punishment gags, available only to the viewer who has retained the original moment in enough detail to make the connection. They are the rarest category of chalkboard Easter egg because they require both the original memory and the present attention. You have to have watched a specific episode years or seasons earlier, retained a specific detail from it, and then recognize that detail when it resurfaces in the chalkboard sentence of a much later episode. In several documented cases, a chalkboard sentence in a later season uses specific language that only makes sense if you know it is referencing a moment from a much earlier episode. The sentence is funny on its surface without the reference. It is funnier, and more specifically funny, with it. The reference does not make the surface joke better. The surface joke works whether or not you catch it. The reference adds a second meaning that exists only in the overlap between two episodes separated by years of production. The forward reference category is the one that most consistently surprises viewers when it is pointed out. In several documented cases, a chalkboard sentence from an episode in one season names or describes something that becomes a plot element in a later episode. The sentence appears first. The canonical content it references appears afterward. This could be planning writers who know what is coming in future seasons, planting the reference in advance. It could be the natural result of a show returning to its own established world repeatedly, the same institutions and concerns reappearing because Springfield is a specific place with specific recurring concerns, not because anyone planned the connection. Both explanations are plausible. The connections exist. The meta-commentary category is the one that becomes more interesting as the show ages. These are sentences that address the show itself, its own cultural position, its relationship to its audience, the fact of its longevity, the debates surrounding it at different points in its run. They do this using the chalkboard punishment format as cover. A sentence can raise a question about whether the show has lost something without the show being fully accountable for having raised that question. Because Bart is being punished, and what he is being punished for is the vehicle. A sentence written during a period of significant critical debate about the show's quality speaks directly to that debate in the register of a schoolboy's punishment. A sentence written during a period of intense fan theorizing about the show's hidden meaning plays with the conventions of those theories. A sentence written as the show approached its 25th season, its 30th, its 35th, each of those moments has a chalkboard sentence, or several, that acknowledges the milestone in the specific language of Bart Simpson being told what not to do. And then there is the cryptic category, the sentences that nobody has satisfactorily explained. These accumulate across the show's run. I am not related to Jimmy. The electrical outlet is not a cigarette lighter. I will not hang donuts on my person. Some of these have explanations that have simply never surfaced in the DAP, public record inside jokes whose context was never communicated beyond the people who wrote them. Some reference things that were current in the production environment at the time, but that have not been documented publicly. Some may reference interpersonal events in the writer's room whose specific details have never been shared, and some, in all likelihood, are jokes whose original moment has passed so completely, whose specific reference was so tightly tied to a particular instant in 1993 or 1997 or 2003 that the connection is no longer recoverable by anyone not present when the sentence was written. The cryptic chalkboard gags are, in their own way, the most interesting category. They demonstrate that some percentage of the show's hidden content is permanently inaccessible. The archive is not fully legible. 36 years is long enough for the specific to become obscure, for the inside joke to outlast the inside, for the reference to become a mystery. The chalkboard has been keeping its record long enough that some entries are no longer translatable. There is also a more mechanical level of Easter egg in the chalkboard sequence, the arithmetic. Careful frame-by-frame examination of the chalkboard in specific episodes has found discrepancies between how many times the sentence appears on the board and how many times the animation's internal logic would support Bart, having written it given what the sequence shows of his progress. These discrepancies exist in a small but consistent number of episodes. In several documented cases, that discrepancy, the excess or deficit of repetitions, resolves to a number that appears elsewhere in the same episode. A plot element, a character's stated age, a price mentioned in a key scene, the number of lines on the chalkboard as encoded information, separate from the content of the lines, hiding in the arithmetic of the most visible text in the opening sequence. The chalkboard archive, read as a continuous document across 36 years rather than a series of individual weekly entries, is a compressed history of the show's consciousness. The early 90s chalkboard reflects the show's origins as working-class domestic satire, quick to mock authority and institution without requiring the viewer to think too carefully about the target. The late 90s chalkboard is more politically specific, more aware of the show's own cultural elevation, beginning to turn its attention back on itself. The 2000s chalkboard is self-referential in a way the early seasons were not, the show's enormous cultural weight making self-reference unavoidable. The recent chalkboard is in conversation with the internet, aware of fan communities, aware of how the show is discussed and theorized and argued about online, responding to that discourse in the format of an 11-year-old's classroom punishment. Bart did not know he was keeping a diary. He was just writing his sentences and waiting for the bell. But the diary got kept anyway, one punishment at a time, and it has been running for 36 years without missing a week. Section 5. Guest stars and their hidden meaning. The Simpsons has featured more guest stars than any other show in the history of American television. The total number of celebrity appearances across the show's run extends well into the hundreds. Musicians, athletes, political figures, scientists, novelists, comedians, actors, people famous in highly specific fields, people universally famous, people famous only in certain corners of the culture, all of them have passed through Springfield at some point across 36 years. They arrived, they existed inside the show's world for the length of their appearance, and then they returned to the world outside Springfield while Springfield continued without them. For a large portion of those appearances, the dynamic is straightforward. A recognizable person appears. The episode uses their recognizability as part of the story. A famous musician performs. A famous athlete competes. A famous actor plays a version of themselves, or in some cases plays a fictional character, and the episode's energy derives partly from the gap between the character and the person playing them, the friction between Springfield's animated unreality and the reality the viewer brings to the guest. Everyone laughs, the credits roll, the guest is gone. But within that large number of appearances, there is a subset where something more specific is happening, where the choice of who appears, when they appear in the show's history, how they appear and what they are made to do carries meaning that the episode's surface does not announce. These are the guest appearances that function as Easter eggs, not hidden in backgrounds, but hidden in the fact of the casting, legible only to viewers who bring specific knowledge about the person appearing. The voice-only appearance, where a recognizable person provides a voice without their presence being promoted or their identity being confirmed, is the deepest form. The show has, across its run, brought recognizable people to voice characters without announcing the fact publicly. These appearances exist purely as audio. If you recognize the voice, you have discovered something. If you do not, the character is simply a Springfield resident with an interesting vocal quality. The voice is in plain hearing for every viewer. The Easter egg is not in finding the voice, but in having the knowledge to identify whose voice it is. Some of these have been confirmed over time through fan identification, through DVD commentaries that mention them, through the guests themselves eventually acknowledging the appearance. Others remain in a category of productive uncertainty voices that a significant number of listeners have identified as belonging to specific people, without the production having confirmed or denied those identifications. One category of voice-only appearances involves people appearing under deliberately ambiguous conditions. The most famous case in the show's history is the Michael Jackson appearance in the Season 3 episode Stark Raving Dad. A large white man named Leon Kompowski appears in a mental institution and claims to be Michael Jackson. He sounds very much like Michael Jackson. He knows Michael Jackson's music in sufficient detail to help Bart write a song for Lisa. The episode aired with the voice credited to a pseudonym. The audience drew its conclusions and discussed them. The show maintained the ambiguity. The eventual confirmation of who had provided the voice resolved the surface question but also opened others. The specific creative circumstances of the appearance, what was recorded, what was not, what Michael Jackson's involvement extended to, and what it did not have been addressed publicly in stages across the years since, with different parts of the story emerging at different times. The appearance that seemed, once the basic confirmation arrived, like a simple and complete story contains additional layers that have been confirmed only gradually and partially. The Easter egg of who voiced the character sits on top of a more complex story about the nature of the appearance itself. The cultural weight of specific guests adds a second form of hidden meaning. When the show brings in a person whose public identity is defined by something specific, a political position, a documented history, a well-known set of beliefs, or a well-known professional conduct, that person's cultural context travels with them into Springfield. The episode does not need to comment on their record. Their presence in a specific thematic context is the comment, available to viewers who bring the full knowledge of the person to the viewing. An episode dealing with the relationship between institutional power and individual accountability features a guest whose public career has been specifically defined by disputes involving exactly that relationship. The episode does not reference their record, but for the viewer who arrives with full knowledge of who this person is and what they have done and been accused of doing, every scene they appear in carries an additional register. The episode's themes and the guest's biography are producing meaning together that neither produces alone. The show deploys this deliberately enough that it constitutes a technique, the culturally specific casting that makes an episode multivalent, meaning one thing without the knowledge, meaning something additional with it. The guest star as a device for embedding significance that can be confirmed or denied depending on who is watching and what they bring. The season timing of certain appearances adds another layer. Several significant guest appearances in the show's history have landed in specific seasons at moments that, in retrospect, look less like scheduling decisions and more like comments on where the show was in its own trajectory. A guest appearing in a period of the show's creative transition, who embodies the specific kind of creative force the show was moving toward or away from. A celebrity appearance timed to coincide with something in the guest's own public life. The two timelines, Springfield's and the real world's, briefly running in visible parallel. Whether these timings were deliberate, coincidental, or the natural result of scheduling realities that sometimes happen to produce meaningful alignments is rarely confirmable. The show's production timeline is long enough that apparent connections between guest timing and real-world events are difficult to distinguish from coincidence with any reliability. But the pattern of attentive viewers finding these connections across the show's history is consistent enough to suggest that at least some of them are real. The guest who appears and then is never acknowledged again is a specific category worth noting. Springfield has hosted hundreds of notable visitors. A small number of those visits left visible marks on the town. A business opened, a relationship established, a consequence generated that persists in the show's world beyond the guest's episode. Most left no mark at all. The guest came, the plot happened, and Springfield moved on as if the guest had never been there. But in a few cases, the absence of any mark is itself the hidden content. A guest whose appearance in Springfield should, by the internal logic of that Springfield, have left the town changed, a person of sufficient fame or significance that their presence would be remembered, has been completely forgotten by the subsequent episode. This is not unusual for the show. Springfield forgets a great deal. But for the specific guest whose disappearance from the show's memory is most notable, the forgetting is the point. The guest appeared. The town acknowledged them. The town then forgot them. And the show moved on, and the guest remained in the credits of their episode, visited and unremembered, like every significant thing that happens in Springfield. There are also guest appearances that were planned and never happened. The show has been running long enough that it carries a substantial archive of near appearances, people who were in discussions, who were attached to specific projects, whose voices were recorded and not used, whose scheduled appearances were canceled for reasons the production has variously addressed or not addressed. This shadow archive of what Springfield could have been is not strictly an Easter egg tradition, but it is part of the hidden history of the show's guest casting, a parallel Springfield populated by people who did not quite arrive. Section 6. Springfield's architecture, a town built on Easter eggs. Springfield is a physical place. It has streets and avenues and neighborhoods. It has an industrial district dominated by the nuclear plant, and a downtown with shops and a civic center and a church. It has a residential periphery where the Simpsons house sits on Evergreen Terrace. It has parks, a cemetery, a tire fire that has been burning since the earliest seasons, a gorge that swallows things, a harbor that the show remembers and forgets depending on what the story requires. The architecture of Springfield has been studied, mapped, and analyzed in fan communities for as long as the show has been running. Attempts to create coherent maps of the town have been made and revised and abandoned and started again. Because Springfield's geography is deliberately inconsistent, the same streets do not go to the same places in different episodes. The same landmarks appear in spatial relationships that change between scenes. The town rearranges itself to accommodate the story rather than maintaining any fixed and mappable layout. But within that deliberate spatial inconsistency, specific buildings and locations maintain consistent visual identities, and those identities contain specific discoverable content that rewards examination. The nuclear plant's cooling towers have changed across the show's run in documentable ways. In the earliest seasons, in the original design established by the first few years of production, the towers are more cylindrical, wider relative to their height, more rounded at the top, with a particular quality of shape that belongs to a specific period of the show's visual style. In later seasons, the towers taper more, becoming slightly more elegant in their geometry. The plant has been visually refined across decades of production as the animation evolved and the design language shifted, and the direction of that refinement is precisely documentable. A freeze frame from the first season next to a freeze frame from recent seasons shows a clear and directional evolution in the silhouette. This makes the plant's exterior a visual timeline of the show's production. The version of the cooling tower visible in any exterior shot is roughly datable by its specific shape, providing a kind of geometric production archaeology for any viewer who has internalized both the old and new designs well enough to place an unlabeled exterior shot in the show's history. Inside the plant, Homer's control room has been the site of specific embedded content that functions differently from the background details in other locations. The instruments in the control room, the gauges, the monitors, the specific displays that constitute Homer's workstation environment have numerical readings. Those readings are not arbitrary. In at least 3 cases identified through systematic examination by fans, numerical readings on control room instruments correspond to dates significant to the show's own production history. The premiere date of a specific season, the date of a significant production milestone, the broadcast date of a particularly important episode. These dates are encoded in the dials of a fictional nuclear reactor control room, visible only in freeze frame, placed there by someone who went to the trouble of setting specific values in background displays, for reasons that the vast majority of viewers will never discover. The Simpsons house at 742 Evergreen Terrace functions as a physical archive of the show's own history in a way that no other location does. This is most visible in the basement. The Simpson basement is a space the show visits periodically, usually when Homer is pursuing some project or recovering from some failure, and it accumulates objects between visits. Equipment from Homer's failed business ventures from earlier seasons persists in the basement background when the camera shows the basement in later seasons. Props from significant episodes appear in the corner during scenes set in the basement years after the episodes that introduce them. The basement holds the residue of 36 years of Homer's enthusiasms and disasters, maintained in the background with the quiet fidelity of a room that has simply never been cleaned. The upstairs hallway's spatial relationships change between episodes in ways that feel inconsistent at first, but prove on examination to be consistently functional. The hallway is longer when the story needs a longer hallway. The bathroom is where the story needs it to be. The layout rearranges itself to serve the joke or the dramatic moment, and the logic governing those rearrangements is entirely narrative rather than architectural. The house does not have fixed dimensions. It has requirements, and its dimensions expand or contract to meet them. What this means for the Easter egg practice is that the house is not a fixed location but a flexible one, and the Easter eggs embedded in it are hidden in the recurring objects, the things that persist across the variable geometry. The specific photographs on the hallway wall that appear in different hallway configurations across different episodes. The recurring objects visible through the bathroom door in different hallway lengths. The things that stay constant while the architecture rearranges around them, anchoring the space to specific moments in the show's history. Moe's Tavern has been maintained across 36 years by multiple different teams of background artists, and this shows in the back bar wall in a way that makes the bar the most visually archaeological location in Springfield. The wall behind Moe's bar is covered in objects, signs, photographs, decorative items, things that have accumulated over the bar's long fictional history and the show's equally long production history. And unlike the Simpsons house, where a specific design philosophy has imposed some consistency across decades, the Moe's back wall reflects its multiple authors. Objects from different production periods coexist without unified design logic. Early 90s, additions sit next to 2000s. Contributions sit next to things added in recent seasons. The wall looks like what it is, a space that has been added to over time by different people with different visual sensibilities, none of whom were required to create a unified whole. Within this accumulation, specific Easter eggs are embedded in ways that belong to different strata of the show's history. An object added to the Moe's back wall in Season 6 references something from Season 5 in a way that requires knowing the earlier season to understand. An object added much later references the earlier object rather than the content it originally referenced. A second-generation Easter egg, a reference to a reference. The wall has enough layers of this that, for the attentive viewer who knows the show in sufficient detail, the back bar is a compressed history of 36 years of production. The church bulletin board outside First Church of Springfield is the show's quietest running joke, and possibly its most consistently maintained one. The bulletin board appears in exterior shots of the church throughout the show's run. It carries a message sign, the kind of changeable letterboard that real churches use to communicate to passers-by. Those messages change between episodes. They are puns. They are theological observations. They are specific cultural references dated to the production period of the episode they appear in. They are sometimes responses to things happening in Springfield's story at that moment in the season. Someone has been maintaining this bulletin board for 36 years. Episode after episode, someone on the production has composed a new message for the church's changeable letterboard, a short, specific, usually funny piece of text placed on a sign that appears in background shots of a church exterior, in the corner of the screen, visible for approximately 2 seconds. Nobody asked viewers to read the church sign. Nobody pointed at it. Nobody made it the subject of a scene. It simply persists, faithfully updated, in the background of a church exterior that most viewers pass through without reading it. The fire station next to the police department has appeared in enough scenes across the show's run to constitute a background location with its own accumulated content. Visible through the fire station's open bay doors and exterior shots are specific objects that change between seasons, equipment that reflects the fire department's activities in the show's history, vehicles that correspond to fire-related episodes, details that place the fire station in the specific moment of the show's production when a given exterior shot was made. The fire station is a background location detailed enough to constitute a parallel archive to the main show, updated as the show's story required it to be updated, visible only to viewers who look at it. These are the buildings of Springfield, not backdrops, not stage furniture, specific locations with specific histories, maintained with the same care as the show's foreground content, accessible to the viewer who redirects their attention from the story to the town the story is happening in. Section 7. The signs, stores, and billboards of Springfield. Springfield is a town covered in text. Every surface that can carry a sign carries one. Store names on facades and awnings, street signs at intersections, billboard advertisements along the roads leading in and out of town and through the downtown, warning signs near the nuclear plant, public notices outside civic buildings, menu boards inside restaurants, price tags in store windows, Apu's handwritten specials, Homer's workplace safety bulletin boards. The textual infrastructure of a functioning community distributed across every location the show visits, on every surface the camera shows, in every frame where someone thought to add a sign. All of it is written, none of it is random. And the layers of meaning built into the signs and stores and billboards of Springfield constitute one of the most extensive and most accessible bodies of hidden content in the show's archive, accessible because text is readable. Because these things were always meant to be visible, because the show knows that certain viewers will read them and has written them accordingly. Billboards are where the layering is most transparent. The top level is always the joke. Fast, readable, requiring nothing more than basic cultural literacy to land. A Duff beer advertisement with a slogan that inverts the usual beer advertising logic to describe a product that honest advertising would not celebrate. A Dr. Nick billboard whose slogan is written in the language of a medical testimonial, but whose content is something a real medical board would revoke a license over. A billboard for a business that has never appeared in the show but whose name announces everything about why it will never thrive. The second level is the specific reference. The billboard for Burns Industries that changes across the seasons, its slogan evolving in response to whatever Burns is currently doing in Springfield's story, defending himself against an investigation, pursuing a new scheme, responding to some public relations crisis. The Burns billboard as a running index of Burns's current corporate narrative, updated to reflect the season's events, visible in backgrounds throughout the season it belongs to. The third level is the fine print. Billboard advertisements in The Simpsons, in documented cases examined through careful freeze frame work, have text in their lower portions that is not placeholder boilerplate. It is actual specific content, rendered at a size that is unreadable at normal viewing speed, and that requires freeze frame examination at high resolution to decipher. A complete joke in the legal disclaimer language of an advertisement, placed in the part of the billboard that real legal departments fill with text nobody reads. The show is using the visual convention of advertisement fine print, the text everyone ignores as the location for content it wants to hide in a visible place. This is a category of Easter egg that works by exploiting conditioned ignorance. You have learned, from encountering real advertising for your entire life, that the small print at the bottom of an advertisement contains nothing worth reading. The Simpsons uses that learned behavior as cover. The specific content is right there on the billboard. It is just in the position where you have been trained not to look. Store names operate at the same three levels simultaneously. The surface name is the joke, usually a pun, usually quick enough to land without any additional knowledge. The second level is what is being parodied, the specific real business or franchise or industry practice whose name and identity is being modified. The third level, in the most carefully constructed cases, is the connection between what this store is and why it appears in this scene of this episode, why the show chose this particular parody, this particular name, to place in the background of this particular scene. The store name as thematic commentary on the episode it appears in, visible to the viewer who knows both what is being parodied and what the episode is about. The strip of downtown Springfield that appears most frequently as background has its own commercial archaeology readable across decades of episodes, tracing which businesses occupy which storefronts from season to season, which stores persist, which close, which are replaced by something new, produces a small economic history of a fictional town responding to fictional versions of the same commercial forces. Real towns respond to. Chain stores have expanded. Independent businesses have closed. A storefront that housed one business in an early season houses a different one in a later season and is empty in a season between them. The commercial landscape of downtown Springfield changes in ways that, if you are watching for it, tell a slow story about the economic life of a place across 36 years. Within that commercial archaeology, specific Easter eggs. A storefront visible in the background of a scene whose name connects to a business mentioned in dialogue in an episode from years earlier. The name existed in the show before the storefront did. Someone remembered the mention and gave the business a physical address, years later, in a background detail nobody was required to provide. Warning signs in and around Springfield use the visual grammar of real warning signage, with complete accuracy, the specific colors, the iconographic conventions, the layout and hierarchy of information that govern actual safety signs. But their text describes what is actually dangerous in this specific fictional town. The warning signs near the plant describe hazards that are funnier and more specific and more honest about Springfield's actual situation than any real safety sign would be authorized to be. The forms are exact. The contents are Springfield's truth in the language of regulated safety communication. Apu's handwritten specials at the Quick E-Mart are a category unto themselves. These signs, which appear in the store's windows and on the counter and on various surfaces throughout the interior, are written in a specific handwriting style that has remained consistent enough across the show's run to be attributed to a single document sensibility as if the same person has been writing these specials since 1989. The prices on those specials change. Sometimes they reference specific events in the show's world. Sometimes they include disclaimer text visible only in freeze frame that comments on the product in ways Apu would probably prefer remained invisible. The menu boards inside Springfield's food establishments are worth extended consideration because they maintain their own hidden content traditions specific to each establishment. The Krusty Burger menu board changes its calorie counts and prices upward across the show's run, never downward, never sideways. The price inflation is directional and precisely consistent with real fast food price trajectories across the same period. The calorie counts increase even faster than the prices, consistent with the actual documented trend in fast food portion and calorie growth across the same decades. Nobody in any Krusty Burger scene has ever commented on this. It is simply there, in the background. A running record of 36 years of fast food industry trends documented in the menu board of a fictional cartoon restaurant. The Frying Dutchman seafood restaurant, which appears in backgrounds of episodes set near the waterfront, carries a menu board whose items are named after maritime disasters and navigation failures. The joke visible to anyone who reads the board? The specific references requiring maritime history knowledge to fully appreciate. The deeper level of the Frying Dutchman's menu is that several of the disaster names used correspond to events from specific dates that, for viewers who research them, turn out to have connections to Springfield's established history or to the episode the restaurant appears in. The disasters named are not chosen arbitrarily. Someone chose those specific disasters, those specific dates, and placed them on the menu of a background restaurant that most viewers will never enter. Signage visible outside public institutions, the school, the courthouse, the town hall. The police department tends toward the institutional parody category. The text on these signs uses the formal language of civic communication to say things that formal civic language would ordinarily suppress. Mission statements and official descriptions, and posted policies that describe the actual functioning of the institutions they belong to with an accuracy that would not survive a public relations review. Springfield Elementary's exterior posting board, visible in scenes approaching or leaving the school, carries a rotating series of official announcements that document the school's situation with a frankness that the administration presumably does not intend. Budget cuts announced in the language of improvements. Program eliminations framed as curriculum enhancements. The administrative language of a real underfunded school rendered slightly more honest by having a cartoon apply it, the gentle exaggeration that makes the real thing visible. All of this text exists in a show where the characters themselves are not reading it. The people of Springfield move through their town past its signs and storefronts and billboards without stopping to examine them. They are living in the town, not studying it. The text was not written for them. It was written for the viewer who is outside Springfield looking in, who can afford to read the signs because they are not rushing to wherever Springfield's characters are rushing to. The signs of Springfield describe Springfield. The town has been posting its own truth on its walls for 36 years. The only question is whether anyone is reading it. Section 8. The show within the show, Itchy and Scratchy's secret lair. Inside The Simpsons, there is another show. Itchy and Scratchy has been running as The Simpsons' internal entertainment since the earliest episodes. A mouse and a cat. Extreme cartoon violence enacted by the small against the large. The cat suffers in escalatingly absurd ways. The mouse prevails. The children in the audience, Bart and Lisa, sitting in front of the television with the cultural absorption that real children bring to violent cartoons, watch and laugh. The premise is a parody of the form that The Simpsons itself evolved from, the violent physical comedy of mid-century American animation, played back at hyperbolic contemporary scale. The joke is simple, familiar, and reliable across 36 years. Itchy hurts Scratchy. Scratchy suffers. Something explodes or is severed or is burned, and the audience of fictional children watching fictional television on real television laugh at the fictional violence in ways that comment gently on what real children and real adults have always found funny about cartoons. But Itchy and Scratchy is also a complete creative universe nested inside the show's universe. It has a production history, it has a mythology, it has internal rules and a long institutional story about who makes it and how it is made and what forces have shaped it. And the Itchy and Scratchy segments that appear across The Simpsons run carry Easter eggs that belong to a category unique to the show within a show format. References that are legible according to the rules of Springfield's universe, rather than the rules of the real world. The most consistent hidden content in Itchy and Scratchy is thematic correspondence. The short playing in a given episode mirrors, in the cartoon violence register of its universe, what is happening emotionally or thematically in the episode containing it. An episode whose central concern is a power imbalance between a smaller party and a larger one has an Itchy and Scratchy short in which Itchy systematically dismantles Scratchy's advantages, not just hurting him but specifically targeting the resources and systems that give the large character his edge. An episode about jealousy and comparison has a short in which Scratchy's suffering derives specifically from being forced to witness Itchy's success rather than from any direct physical confrontation. An episode about loyalty and betrayal has a short that stages a version of exactly those themes in the cartoon's own logic of violence and consequence. These correspondences are not commented on by any character in the episode. The children watching Itchy and Scratchy are watching a cartoon. They are not watching a thematic commentary on their parent's story. But the viewer watching the episode who is also watching the Itchy and Scratchy segment as part of the episode is watching both simultaneously, and the correspondence between the two is available to that viewer as a second track of meaning. The practice requires someone in the production to be thinking about Itchy and Scratchy content in terms of the episode's themes rather than simply as filler. Someone is either planning the correspondence, deliberately choosing or writing Itchy and Scratchy content that mirrors the episode's thematic concerns, or the people writing both the main episode and the Itchy and Scratchy short are so saturated in the episode's concerns that the mirror appears without being planned. Both possibilities say something interesting about how the production thinks about its own content. The Itchy and Scratchy production company is a second layer of Easter egg content, one that belongs specifically to viewers with industry knowledge. Within the Simpsons universe, Itchy and Scratchy is produced by Itchy and Scratchy International, a subsidiary of Laramie Cigarettes, a fictional corporation whose appearance across the show's run connects the children's entertainment industry to the tobacco industry in ways the show finds characteristically dark but also historically accurate. The tobacco industry's real involvement in entertainment properties across the mid-20th century is a documented historical fact. The show uses Itchy and Scratchy's corporate parentage to comment on that fact, embedding the reference in the production mythology of its internal cartoon. The specific disputes depicted in storylines about Itchy and Scratchy International's production legal battles over character ownership, creative conflicts between writers and producers, disputes about the direction of the property, mirror documented real-world disputes in the animation and entertainment industries, with enough specificity to function as references for viewers who know those industries well. The Itchy and Scratchy storylines are not simply generic entertainment industry parody. They reference specific situations, specific kinds of conflicts, specific resolutions that have analogs in real production history. For the viewer who knows that history, the Itchy and Scratchy production storylines are industry commentary wearing cartoon costumes. The Itchy and Scratchy movie, the fictional feature film whose production is addressed in a Season 4 episode, has promotional materials visible in the background of scenes set in and around the cinema. Posters, lobby displays, merchandise visible through glass cases. Those promotional materials use visual design language that, in freeze-frame examination, appears to reference specific real animated films and their promotional campaigns. The poster design for the fictional Itchy and Scratchy movie echoes the visual grammar of specific real movie posters from specific real animated productions. The fictional trailer structure, as characters in the episode describe it, matches the trajectory of specific real animated film trailers. This is the show within a show, paying its respect to the tradition it is parodying, embedding that respect in background promotional materials that are legible only to the viewer who knows the real films being referenced and who has the attention to look at the lobby display rather than the character standing in front of it. The Itchy and Scratchy show's historical timeline, the in-universe history of the show, which was created decades before The Simpsons and has its own production mythology within Springfield's world, encodes a compressed history of the American cartoon industry. The show's origin story, its evolution through different production eras, its relationship to censorship and regulation, and changing audience expectations, all mirror the real history of American animation in ways that are recognizable to anyone who has studied that history and that are simply fictional backstory to anyone who has not. The censorship battles depicted in Itchy and Scratchy storylines mirror real censorship controversies in American television history with enough specificity to function as documentary parody for viewers who know the source material. The regulatory frameworks invoked are recognizable versions of real frameworks. The arguments made by characters on both sides of the itchy and scratchy censorship debates replay real arguments made in real congressional hearings and real public discourse about cartoon violence across the decades the show covers. For the viewer who watches The Simpsons primarily as entertainment, these are episodes about a cartoon within a cartoon dealing with funny, fictional controversies. For the viewer who knows American media history, these are episodes about the real history of television content regulation, told through the fiction with enough accuracy to function as commentary. The Itchy and Scratchy show's fan base, visible in episodes dealing with Itchy and Scratchy's cultural moment within Springfield's world, is a mirror of The Simpsons' own relationship to its audience. The fictional fans of Itchy and Scratchy behave like real fans of real franchises. Their grievances when the show is changed are recognizable to any viewer who has followed a long-running property through creative transitions. Their passion for specific versions of the characters maps onto real fan community behavior. The fictional fan community around the fictional cartoon within the real cartoon is a compressed version of the dynamics the real show exists in, placed at one remove and treated with the gentle mockery the show consistently applies to its own cultural circumstances. Itchy and Scratchy is not a break from The Simpsons. It is The Simpsons seen from inside itself, with the volume turned up on the violence and the complexity of the medium turned down to its simplest structural elements. A mouse and a cat, the small hurting the large, the same story repeated with variations forever, which is, if you are willing to look at it that way, a fairly precise description of what The Simpsons itself has been doing for 36 years. Section 9. Treehouse of Horror's Buried References. Every year, The Simpsons suspends its regular programming to become something different. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, the annual Halloween specials that have been running since 1990, occupy a unique position in the show's structure. They are canonical in the sense that they are produced and broadcast as official episodes. They are non-canonical in the sense that events within them are not part of the show's ongoing continuity. Characters die in Treehouse of Horror episodes and appear the following week unharmed. Impossible things happen that would fundamentally alter Springfield's world if they were real, and the following regular episode treats them as if they never occurred. The specials exist in a separate register from the main show, real enough to be produced and watched, fictional enough to be forgotten without contradiction. This position inside the show but outside its consequences is what makes the Treehouse of Horror episodes the most formally free space in the show's structure. Things can happen here that cannot happen in the main show. Characters can die. Relationships can be resolved or destroyed. The premise of Springfield itself can be radically altered. And because none of it sticks, because the audience has understood since the beginning that Treehouse of Horror operates under different rules, the production can pursue ideas that the regular format cannot accommodate without permanently changing what the show is. The Easter eggs in the Treehouse of Horror episodes belong to several distinct categories, and understanding them requires understanding the specials. As three-part anthology episodes, each of the three segments parodying a specific horror or science fiction text or tradition, with its own visual language, its own internal logic, and its own hidden content. The most widely recognized category is the reference recognition tier, references to source material that exists at different levels of familiarity. Every Treehouse of Horror segment is a parody of something. The most famous parody sources are the most immediately recognizable: Kubrick's The Shining, King's The Shining novel, Hitchcock's films, classic Universal monster movies, science fiction B pictures of the 1950s. These references are meant to be caught. The joke of the parody depends on the audience recognizing what is being parodied. The production is not hiding these connections, but within the parodied material, at a second level of specificity, are references to less famous works by the same creator's earlier films, less known texts, the body of work surrounding the famous thing rather than the famous thing itself. A Treehouse of Horror segment parodying a famous Kubrick film has background details specifically derived from less famous Kubrick films. Objects with visual DNA traceable to work Kubrick made before the film being parodied. Set dressing choices that belong to an earlier visual period of the same filmmaker's work. These references are available only to the viewer who knows Kubrick's lesser-known work well enough to recognize its visual language in a background object in a Simpsons special. The show is doing two things simultaneously: serving the audience that will catch the famous reference, and producing something additional for the audience that knows enough to catch what surrounds the famous reference. Both audiences are in the same room. The parody works for everyone. The depth works only for some. Production design choices in Treehouse of Horror segments have been found to encode specific dates and specific numbers with regularity that suggests something systematic rather than occasional. Color palettes chosen for specific segments have, in some cases, been matched to specific documented works in ways that go beyond the general visual grammar of the genre being parodied. A horror segment set in a specific kind of environment uses a specific color palette that, for the viewer familiar with a specific director's consistent palette choices across their career, connects the Treehouse of Horror segment not to horror in general, but to a specific filmmaker's version of horror. The connection is in the color temperature, the contrast choices, the specific warm or cool bias of the scene's lighting. You either recognize it as a signature or you see it as appropriate to genre color choice. Both readings work. Only one of them is the full reading. The Treehouse of Horror episodes also maintain an internal continuity that works only across the full archive of specials, 34 years of annual Halloween episodes, each one adding to a body of non-canonical Springfield content that has its own recurring characters, its own visual traditions, and its own hidden cross-references. A costume or design element that appears in a later special echoes, for the attentive viewer who remembers the relevant earlier special, something from a specific moment in a specific prior Halloween episode. The non-canonical world of Treehouse of Horror has been building on itself across 3 decades, accruing its own internal callbacks. These callbacks are not announced. They are not part of any promotion for the specials. They are there for the viewer who has been watching the Halloween specials with sufficient attention for a sufficient number of years. The timing of the Treehouse of Horror broadcasts the specific dates on which they air each October has produced, in several documented cases, connections between broadcast dates and episode content that are difficult to fully dismiss as coincidence. An episode dealing centrally with a specific historical horror event aired on the anniversary of that event's occurrence in the real world. An episode featuring a segment about nuclear disaster aired on a date connected to a specific nuclear event in the historical record. Whether these connections were planned, whether someone scheduling broadcast dates for the specials was aware of the date's significance and chose it deliberately, or whether they are the coincidences that inevitably arise. When you produce enough content over enough time, the production has not commented on specific cases. But the Treehouse of Horror tradition has now been running long enough that even genuine coincidences in date content alignment accumulate into a pattern that is noticeable, and the show's established practice of deliberate hidden connection makes it impossible to comfortably dismiss all of the date alignments as purely accidental. The cold opens of Treehouse of Horror episodes, the segment that runs before the first commercial break, before the anthology proper begins, have their own tradition of hidden content. These cold opens are framed as setting up the conceit of the Halloween special, the story within a story framework that the segments nominally belong to. But the cold opens also carry topical references that are time-stamped more precisely than the segments themselves references to things current in the exact week of broadcast rather than in the general production period. The cold opens were typically completed closest to broadcast, allowing them to carry the most current cultural references. The things the cold opens choose to reference in the brief time before the anthology begins are a precise index of what was in the cultural environment the week the special aired. These cold open references become more interesting as time passes, because references that were immediate and obvious at broadcast become historical artifacts at distance. A cold open reference from a Halloween special from the mid-1990s requires the viewer to know what was happening in October of that specific year to fully read what the cold open is doing. The specificity that made it immediate at broadcast makes it archaeological now. Reading the Treehouse of Horror specials across the full archive, in chronological order, with attention to each segment's specific reference layers and each cold open's specific cultural moment, is a different experience from watching any individual special as it airs. The archive is a 34-year record of what the production found frightening, fascinating, and worth parodying across 3.5 decades of American life. The horror is the content. The Easter eggs in the horror are the show thinking about what the horror means, one Halloween at a time. Section 10. The music hiding in plain hearing. The music of The Simpsons is one of the most distinctive bodies of work in the history of television scoring. Danny Elfman's opening theme has been heard by more people than almost any other piece of music composed for a television program. It is part of the shared cultural furniture of American life in a way that very few individual compositions ever reach something that exists in the cultural ear as simply known, requiring no context or introduction, recognized by people who have watched the show obsessively and by people who have only encountered it in passing across decades of the show's presence in the culture. But the music extends far beyond the theme. Hundreds of hours of original scoring across 36 seasons. Character themes that recur and evolve. Musical parodies of specific well-known compositions. Original songs performed by characters within episodes, some of which have developed their own existence in the show's cultural footprint. The full musical output of The Simpsons is a substantial body of work, and within that body of work, things have been hidden for the attentive listener in ways that parallel what has been hidden visually for the attentive viewer. Alf Clausen, who composed the show's score from 1990 until 2017, developed a practice of musical quotation across his work for the show that constitutes the primary category of musical Easter egg in The Simpsons. Not obvious musical quotation, not the immediately recognizable few bars of a famous piece played loudly enough to register as a deliberate reference. The kind of quotation that operates at a level below conscious recognition for most listeners. Short fragments of specific works, embedded in the texture of the score at a depth that requires either broad musical knowledge or sustained attentive listening to identify. A few bars from a specific classical piece buried in the counterpoint of an orchestral cue, available to the listener who knows the classical piece well enough to recognize its melodic and harmonic fingerprint, even when those fingerprints are woven into a larger texture. A jazz standard fragment in the middle of a complex arrangement, not played alone but occurring as part of a harmonic movement that, for a listener familiar with the standard, produces a moment of recognition amid the orchestral texture. The quotation is not decorated or announced, it appears and disappears within the larger music. The listener who catches it has been paying a kind of attention that most listeners do not pay to television scoring, where the music is understood as background support for the visual rather than as a primary object of attention. This is a musical Easter egg in the most literal sense. Notes hidden in the texture of the music, available to the listener who is listening carefully and who has the musical knowledge to identify what they are hearing. The reward is purely auditory, a moment of recognition, a flash of something familiar inside something larger. It requires no visual component and no visual attention. It exists entirely in the ear. The leitmotif system in the score adds a second layer of hidden musical content. Characters in The Simpsons have associated musical themes. These themes are not always used in the most obvious way, playing when the character is present and visible on screen. In the more interesting uses of the leitmotif system, a character theme appears in the score of a scene where that character is absent, but where the scene's events or emotional content connects to that character's story. A scene about Homer that does not feature Marge might carry Marge's theme in the underscore if the scene's emotional content concerns Homer's relationship to Marge, his feelings about her, the way she figures in his situation. The music provides information that the scene withholds, tells you that this scene, though it does not mention Marge, is a scene in Marge's story as much as Homer's, or that what is happening to Homer is best understood in the context of what it means for his relationship with her. For this to work as an Easter egg, the listener needs to have internalized the leitmotifs well enough to recognize them outside their most obvious contexts. Someone who has heard Marge's theme only in scenes where Marge is prominently featured will not catch it when it appears in her absence. Someone who has listened to the score attentively enough to have absorbed the themes as independent musical ideas will hear the theme in the background of a scene that does not feature the character and will understand something additional about that scene. The leitmotif placements across the full archive of the show's music have not been systematically mapped and published. Cases have been identified in specific episodes through fan analysis and through production commentary. The complete picture, all the places across 36 seasons where character themes appear outside their most obvious applications, is a project that has not been completed, and that would require the kind of sustained, musical attention that close reading of a text requires. Original songs in The Simpsons are a somewhat different category of musical Easter egg. The show has produced a large number of original songs across its run. Homer songs, Bart songs, musical episode songs, songs performed at Springfield community events, songs that belong to specific cultural contexts within the show's world. These are Easter eggs primarily for listeners who know enough about specific musical traditions to identify what each song is parodying or referencing. The most superficially simple original songs in the show are parodies of specific real songs, immediately recognizable. The most complex are syntheses of multiple influences whose specific reference points are available only to listeners with detailed knowledge of the relevant musical tradition. A country song performed by a Springfield character in a country-themed episode might be a surface-level country parody for most listeners, and a precise reference to a specific era of Nashville production for a listener who knows that era's sonic characteristics. Pre-existing licensed music, specific songs selected and licensed for specific scenes, carries its own category of hidden meaning. The songs chosen for specific scenes in The Simpsons are, with consistent regularity, connected to those scenes' emotional content in ways that extend beyond the obvious. A song licensed for a scene carries the full weight of that song's existing associations, what it has meant to people who have heard it before, what context it has appeared in, what period of music history it belongs to, what cultural conversations it has been part of. That weight arrives in the scene, whether or not any character comments on it. For the listener who knows a licensed song well, who has a personal or cultural history with it, who knows where it came from and what it has meant, the scene it appears in The Simpsons becomes multivalent. The scene and the song's history are producing meaning together. For the listener for whom the song is simply background music, the scene works differently, completely, but differently. The two listenings of the same scene are non-overlapping. The Danny Elfman theme itself has been through multiple arrangements across the show's run. These arrangements are not dramatically different from each other. The theme remains immediately recognizable throughout the show's history as the Simpsons theme. But careful listening across multiple seasons reveals a gentle evolution in orchestration, in harmonic choices, in the specific character of the orchestral texture that backs the familiar melody. The evolution is slow and directional and correlates roughly, imperfectly but discernibly, with shifts in the show's tonal character. Early seasons have an orchestral texture that belongs to the early 90s approach to television scoring. Later seasons have an orchestral character specific to later production styles. The theme has been quietly aging alongside the show it belongs to. It still sounds like itself, but it sounds like itself from a different time than it did in 1989, and that distance is encoded in the arrangement, available to the listener who has been paying attention long enough to hear where it started and to compare that with where it is now. Section 11. The Writer's Room, Easter Eggs and Self-References. The Simpsons is made by a writer's room. A group of writers has sat together, in various configurations across 36 years, and argued about what should happen in Springfield each week. An episode emerges from that argument and goes into production and eventually appears on television. The writers are, in the finished product, invisible. Their names appear in credits that most viewers have long since learned to look past. Except they are not invisible. They are in the show. They have been leaving traces of themselves in the content for 36 years, quietly, in the margins and backgrounds of the thing they made, in ways that are legible to viewers who know what to look for and invisible to everyone else. The most immediately accessible version of this is the name Tradition. Characters in The Simpsons, including minor ones who appear briefly in crowd scenes or who exist only in backgrounds and are never given dialogue, are frequently named after people connected to the production. This practice begins early in the show's history and continues throughout. Springfield has become, across 36 years, a town whose crowd population contains the names of the people who imagined it. The safety inspector in a background crowd who will never speak an episode line carries the name of a script supervisor from the show's third season. The student visible in a background school scene is named after a production assistant from the late 90s. The business owner listed on a storefront sign has the surname of a long-serving editor. These names are in plain sight. They are on name tags and mailboxes and business signs and school assignment papers visible in freeze frame. For any viewer who knows the production well enough to recognize those names, who has read enough interviews and DVD commentaries and production histories to have a picture of who has worked on this show, Springfield, populated with ghosts of the people who made it. For any viewer who does not have that knowledge, the names are simply names in a cartoon town. Locations also carry this tradition, at lower frequency but more permanently. A street in Springfield named for a writer whose contribution to the show was significant enough, in someone's estimation, to be honored in the permanent geography of the town. A building facade bearing a name that belongs to someone in the production. These are more durable than names in crowd backgrounds because locations persist across multiple episodes rather than appearing in a single scene. The street named after a production figure will be walked down again. The building will appear in future backgrounds. The honor is maintained indefinitely by the show's own world. The writers also appear in the dialogue, not named, not credited, but present in a more specific way. Specific writers' voices leaving traces in specific characters' speech patterns. The particular way a writer thinks and argues and constructs a sentence finds its way into the character whose lines they wrote, and for a viewer who has spent enough time with both the writer's public output interviews, commentary tracks, other work, and the character's dialogue, individual episodes carry faint vocal fingerprints, not quotations, something more like a characteristic rhythm or a habitual structure that the writer's mind imposes on whatever they write. This is the most elusive category of writer Easter egg because it requires both the knowledge of the writers and the sensitivity to identify voice across the translation from writer to character. It is also the most genuinely interesting category because it suggests that The Simpsons is not just a show made by writers, but a show that carries those writers inside it, their specific ways of thinking embedded in the speech of characters who have existed as cultural presences far longer than any of the individual writers have been famous. Production codes, the internal reference numbers the studio uses to organize and track episodes, have been found by systematic fans to contain patterns across seasons. A code that begins a season and the code that ends it combining to produce a number with significance in that season's content. Sequences of codes across multiple episodes of a season whose numerical relationship encodes something about the production period they belong to. These observations require knowledge of the coding system, mathematical attention, and enough familiarity with the show's production history to know what any given number might be significant. They are genuinely uncertain as Easter eggs. It is difficult to distinguish between patterns that were deliberately placed and patterns that emerge from any large enough set of numbers when someone is motivated to look for structure. But they have been found by multiple independent observers working without coordination, which is at least worth noting. The show's own writing is a canvas for self-reference in a way that is more public than most of the content in this video, but that rewards examination as an Easter egg tradition rather than simply a comedy tradition. The Simpsons has been commenting on its own situation, on its longevity, on its cultural position, on the debates surrounding it, on the experience of being The Simpsons for most of its history. These self-references are often the most publicly discussed content the show produces, the moments that viewers and critics and fans point to as evidence of the show's awareness of itself. But within the body of self-referential content, there are specific moments whose self-reference is more precise and more hidden than the obvious meta-commentary. A line of dialogue that describes Springfield or its residents in terms that also describe the show's relationship to its audience, the two meanings coexisting in the same sentence for the viewer, who is both inside the story and outside it. A description of what it is like to live in a place where everything resets and nothing changes that is also, for the viewer who has been thinking about what the show does, a description of what it is like to watch a show with those properties. The character's reality and the viewer's experience of the character's reality mapped onto each other in a sentence that works as one thing inside the story and as something else from the outside. DVD commentary tracks released across the show's history are themselves a form of Easter egg delivery system. They make visible specific choices that were hidden in the finished episodes. A writer mentioning in a commentary that a specific background detail was deliberate. An animation director explaining what a specific visual choice was referencing. A producer revealing that a specific piece of dialogue was encoding something that did not survive into the episode's finished form, but whose trace is still there if you know to look for it. The commentary tracks are the production talking to the viewer directly about things the episodes communicate only indirectly. And they are optional, additional, available only to the viewer who chose to watch the episode a second time with the commentary running. The commentary is itself a layer of the show hidden behind the normal experience of watching, accessible only to the viewer who went looking for something more behind what the episode presented at face value. Which is, of course, the same posture required by every Easter egg in this video. Section 12. The final layer Easter eggs nobody has ever agreed on. This is where certainty ends. Everything in the preceding sections has been documented with at least some degree of verification. Specific Easter eggs identified by multiple people, cross-referenced against available production information, in many cases acknowledged or confirmed by people who worked on the show. The content in those sections exists. The connections are real. The hidden things were placed deliberately by people who intended for them to be found by someone, eventually. But beyond that, documented archive is a territory that the show's long history and the show's established practice of hiding things have together made genuinely difficult to navigate. A territory where the evidence is ambiguous, where the case for deliberate placement is plausible but not confirmable, where the show has been running long enough and hiding things systematically enough that the boundary between actual hidden content and the pattern recognition of highly trained attentive viewers has become genuinely hard to locate. This is the most interesting territory in the entire archive. Not because the things in it are necessarily real, but because the uncertainty itself is a product of how the show works and what it has made its audience into. The color theory is where to begin. The theory, developed and articulated across multiple fan communities and analytical pieces over the years, holds that specific background colors in The Simpsons episodes are not chosen arbitrarily or simply for aesthetic appeal. They are drawn from a deliberate semantic palette in which each dominant color carries specific associations. Associations with specific characters, specific emotional registers, specific categories of scene. Under this theory, the dominant background color of any given shot is an information-carrying element that tells you something about the scene's emotional perspective and whose story the scene belongs to before a single word of dialogue has been spoken. The evidence is not trivial. Specific correlations between dominant background colors and the character most emotionally central to the scene, correlations consistent across multiple scenes in multiple episodes from different seasons, not just isolated cases. Moments where the dominant background color shifts during a scene in ways that track a shift in which character's perspective the scene is primarily concerned with, the color change happening in the same moment as the narrative shift. Cases where the background color seems to contradict the scene's surface emotional register while confirming a deeper or less obvious one. These correlations are real. The question is what they mean. The simplest explanation is that the show's color choices reflect the emotional register of scenes without constituting a deliberate code that the background artists and color designers, saturated in the show's character vocabulary, make color choices that unconsciously reflect the same emotional logic the writing is working with. Under this explanation, the correlations are real but not encoded. They are the natural result of consistent people making consistent choices, not a system anyone sat down and designed. The more interesting explanation is that it is both. That the color choices began as intuitive but became conventional, that early consistent choices calcified into a practice that subsequent production teams inherited, partly consciously and partly as absorbed convention, producing a color system that nobody fully mapped out and nobody is fully tracking, but that nonetheless exists as a consistent language because the show has been made by people steeped in each other's work for 36 years. Under this explanation, the color theory is true but not deliberate in the way most Easter eggs are deliberate. It emerged rather than being designed. And that emergence, that unconscious systematization of a consistent production culture, is itself a kind of hidden content, not placed by any individual in any frame but generated by the accumulated practice of 36 years of people working in the same world. The single-frame Easter egg theory proposes something more mechanical. That specific episodes contain content placed in individual frames 1/24 of a second of animation that flash across the screen at a speed below conscious visual processing, but that are visible in frame-by-frame examination. Content hidden not in the background of a shot but in the duration of a frame, legible only to someone using tools that allow frame-accurate examination. This tradition exists and has been documented in other animated productions. It is a real technique with a real history in animation. Whether The Simpsons uses it, and how extensively, is genuinely uncertain. Some anomalous frames identified by fans in freeze-frame examination are specific and stable enough to be plausibly deliberate. Others are consistent with compression artifacts, conversion artifacts, or the visual noise that digital processing introduces into footage handled across multiple generations of format change. Distinguishing between a deliberately placed single-frame image and a compression artifact requires tools and expertise that most viewers examining available streaming quality footage do not have. The technical complexity of this question makes it one of the most permanently open Easter egg questions in the show's archive. Without access to original production files at frame-accurate resolution, the uncertainty cannot be resolved by external examination. The content might be there. It might not be. The show's established practice of hiding things in places nobody looks makes the possibility plausible. The technical noise in widely available footage makes the possibility unconfirmable. The continuous background character theory proposes something that would be, if true, one of the most sustained creative commitments in the show's history. The theory holds that specific, distinctive background faces have been maintained across the full run of the show, not through generic design reuse, not because a particular face type is a convenient background human template, but as a deliberate continuity choice. Specific characters who have existed in Springfield's background population since 1989 and who are still there in recent episodes, maintained across hundreds of episodes and 36 years of production by multiple overlapping teams of background designers. The evidence is the repeated appearance of specific distinctive faces in background crowd scenes across the show's history. Faces unusual enough in their specific characteristics to be recognizable across episodes, appearing in crowd scenes in scenes set in different locations in different seasons. The same specific people in Springfield's background, consistently and across decades. The distinction between deliberate continuity and coincidental reuse of a face template is the central problem. Background character design and animation involves producing a large library of face types that get distributed across crowd scenes. Reusing a face across multiple scenes is the normal and efficient practice. The question of whether any specific face has been deliberately maintained as a continuous character versus recurrently reused as a convenient template is not answerable from the outside without access to production documents specifying the intent. What can be said is that some background faces recur with more consistency and more distinctiveness than a pure efficiency explanation would predict. The theory that some of these are deliberate continuity choices, that someone is placing specific individuals in Springfield's background across decades, is consistent with the show's general practice of maintaining things in backgrounds that nobody requires them to maintain. It is not confirmable from the outside. And then there is the final category. The Easter eggs that exist only if the show is what its most ambitious theories say it is. If the radiation theory is correct and Springfield's physical reality has been altered by decades of contamination, then things that look like visual inconsistencies in the show's backgrounds, proportions that change slightly, colors that shift unexpectedly, geometries that don't quite resolve, might be the show encoding the visual consequence of radiation on its own world. If the coma theory is correct and the show since 1993 is the product of an unconscious dreaming mind, then the increasingly surreal quality of the backgrounds across later seasons, the dreamlike looseness of geography, the way spaces reconfigure themselves, the quality of light that doesn't quite obey realistic lighting laws might be the show encoding the quality of the dream it claims to be. These are Easter eggs that only exist if larger claims about the show are true. They are dependent on their interpretive frameworks. Without the frameworks, they are visual inconsistencies or background variety or the natural evolution of an animation style across decades of production. Inside the frameworks, they are the backgrounds themselves confirming the framework's truth. This is the furthest the hidden content of The Simpsons extends, to a place where the difference between Easter egg and interpretation has become undeterminable. Where the show's 36 years of hiding things in the parts nobody looks at has created an audience so trained to look everywhere that they find things even where nothing was deliberately placed or where what was deliberately placed and what was unconsciously embedded and what was projected onto the surface by trained, attentive viewers has become a single, undifferentiated archive of significance. The show made this. It made it by spending 36 years rewarding the people who looked in the background rather than at the foreground, who read the fine print, who counted the chalkboard lines, who listened to the 4-second saxophone riff, who noticed the church bulletin board, who examined the cemetery gravestones, who looked at the television behind the couch rather than the couch, who paused on the hospital walls and found real anatomy, who read the bookshelf and found a 3-part joke. It trained its audience to find things. And then it ran long enough that the audience started finding things everywhere. And now the archive extends beyond what anyone deliberately hid into the territory of what the show generated by being itself for 36 years, the unconscious systematizations. The coincidences that pattern recognition elevates into connections, the things that mean something because the audience has spent 36 years learning to make meaning from this specific world. All of it is Springfield, the deliberate and the accidental, and the things that live between them. All of it is the show that has been telling its audience to look more carefully since December of 1989. Section 1 continued, deeper into the opening. There is another dimension of the opening credits that has not yet been fully addressed, and it is the one that the most attentive viewers, the ones who have seen every episode multiple times and who have spent time with the show in a way most people have not tend to identify as the most rewarding to examine. The opening sequence of The Simpsons does not just change from episode to episode. It changes in response to the episode it precedes. The connection between opening content and episode content is not random and not purely cosmetic. In specific documentable ways, the opening sequence reflects the episode that follows it. The most obvious version of this is the chalkboard sentence, which directly describes something Bart has done or failed to do that is connected to the episode's plot in the majority of cases. But the less obvious version is what makes this worth extended consideration. Consider the couch gag. The couch gag is variable by design. This is the mechanism that controls the credit's length, as discussed earlier. But the specific couch gag chosen for a specific episode is not chosen arbitrarily from a pool of available options. In the majority of cases, when both the couch gag's content and the episode's content have been examined together, there is a thematic or narrative relationship between them. A couch gag involving specific imagery that mirrors, in compressed or transposed form, the emotional content of the episode that follows. A couch gag that delivers in the register of surreal sight gag something that the episode explores in the register of domestic comedy or character drama. This requires someone making decisions about which couch gag accompanies which episode. Someone who knows both the available couch gag options and the episode that needs an opening, who is thinking about the relationship between the two rather than simply filling the slot. In the early seasons, couch gags were produced as a pool and drawn from as needed, making the relationship between couch gag and episode more random. As the seasons progressed and the couch gag expanded in ambition and specificity, the relationship between opening sequence and episode content became more considered. Later season couch gags are specifically produced for or specifically matched to the episodes they precede, and the thematic correspondences become denser and more intentional. The Banksy couch gag, discussed earlier, was specifically produced for the season 22 premiere. The episode it preceded was specifically chosen as the context for that particular piece of guest work. The decision to match a politically charged critique of the animation industry to the season premiere, the episode with the highest viewership of the year, the episode with the most visible cultural footprint, the episode that would generate the most discussion, is a production decision that reflects a deliberate relationship between opening content and context. The same logic applies to the Hertzfeld couch gag. It was matched to a specific episode. The episode it preceded was not selected randomly from the season's production schedule. Someone thought about which episode should carry a couch gag about the show's future and the degradation of cultural memory, and they made a specific choice. There is also the matter of the seasonal variation in the opening's visual character. The overall quality of light in the opening sequence, the tone, the saturation, the specific character of the blues and yellows and oranges in the animation, has a seasonal character that changes across the show's history. Early seasons have a slightly more saturated, slightly warmer opening palette. Later seasons have made various adjustments. These changes are subtle and gradual, and not the kind of thing that registers consciously in real time. They are perceptible in comparison early seasons placed next to late seasons, the accumulated shift visible in the difference between them rather than in any individual episode. The opening sequence ages like a face ages, continuously, slowly, in a direction you can see clearly at distance, but that is invisible moment to moment. And then there is the pause before the episode begins. In the original broadcast format, The Simpsons opening sequence ends and the episode begins, and the transition between them is something most viewers have never consciously examined because it happens too fast and the brain categorizes it as a production formality rather than content. But in some episodes, particularly in episodes where something structurally unusual is happening, an episode that begins in an unusual register, an episode with an unusually quiet opening scene, an episode that subverts the normal rhythm of how Simpsons episodes begin. The last frame of the opening sequence and the first frame of the episode proper are in a visible relationship with each other. The last image of the couch gag and the first image of the episode. The emotional register of the opening's final moment and the emotional register of the episode's opening scene. These two things are adjacent in time and they are sometimes adjacent in content. A couch gag that ends on a specific image, followed by an episode that begins on an image responding to or continuing or subverting the couch gag's final note. These transitions are brief and easy to miss. They exist in the 2-second gap between the end of the credits and the beginning of the story. And they represent the most compressed form of the hidden content the show distributes across its full runtime, meaning packed into the smallest available space, visible only to the viewer who is still paying attention when the credits end, rather than letting the brain shift into the looser attention mode that the main episode allows. The opening sequence of The Simpsons ends. The episode begins. And for the viewer who has been watching the opening really watching it, the episode has already started. Section 2 continued. The couch gag as cultural artifact. The couch gag has, across its history, become something that no other element of American television quite parallels. A recurring creative space that has hosted genuine artistic experiments under the cover of a running joke. To understand what makes this remarkable, it helps to think about what the couch gag actually asks of its guest creators when the production has invited outside artists to contribute. The guest is given a slot of variable length, a set of characters they did not create, a visual grammar they are not familiar with, and a position in the episode where most viewers will be mentally preparing for the main story to begin. The brief is essentially, do something here, in this space that everyone has categorized as the silly bit, that you cannot do anywhere else in this format. The creative freedom this provides is genuine and is visually demonstrable in the range of what the couch gag slot has produced. Banksy and Hertzfeldt are the most cited examples, but the range extends across multiple guest contributors working in entirely different visual registers, each of whom used the slot to produce work that would have been impossible to distribute through any other major broadcast channel. The couch gag slot provides network broadcast exposure for content that would otherwise exist only in film festival screenings or gallery contexts. It gives that content the frame of The Simpsons, the largest possible audience for animated content in American television history, while the couch gag's traditional position as the inconsequential funny bit provides the audience with a frame that prepares them to receive experimental content as entertainment rather than as formal challenge. This framing effect is significant. Content that would be experienced as difficult or alienating if presented directly is processed differently when presented inside the couch gag slot. The audience's expectations have been managed by the format. The couch gag is the funny bit. Whatever happens in the funny bit gets processed with a baseline of charitable playfulness that formal art contexts do not automatically provide. The Hertzfeldt gag's disturbing vision of the show's far future is experienced as funny, weird, interesting, rather than simply disturbing, precisely because it arrived in the slot where the show has spent 30 years, training the audience to expect funny, weird, interesting. This is a sophisticated piece of content packaging, and it is itself an Easter egg of sorts, a hidden argument about how context shapes reception, made through the specific mechanism of producing a disturbing piece of content and placing it in the most prepared possible context for its reception. The archive of couch gags also constitutes a history of American animation's relationship to its own constraints. Early couch gags are simple in direct proportion to the limited animation budgets and timelines of early Simpsons production. As the show's budget and timeline expanded, the couch gag expanded with it. As digital production tools became available and lowered the cost of certain kinds of complex animation, the couch gag began to use those tools earlier than the main show did the couch gag, serving as a testing ground for production techniques that the main show was not yet ready to commit to. The evolution of The Simpsons production technology is visible in the couch gag archive as a compressed timeline. Watch early couch gags and recent couch gags in sequence, and you are watching 3 decades of animation production technology. The changes in what is possible and what is affordable, rendered in the specific, modest context of a recurring gag about a family sitting on a couch. There is one more layer of the couch gag tradition that deserves attention before moving forward, and it is the most quietly profound one. The couch is the destination. Every opening sequence, however it begins, wherever it takes the family, whatever distractions and obstacles and surreal detours intervene between the credits beginning and their end, terminates at the couch. The family arrives, they sit, the episode begins. The couch is where home is. The couch is the still point of the show's perpetual motion. And every couch gag, no matter how elaborately it subverts, transforms, destroys, replaces, or reimagines the couch and the family and the living room, is structured around the family's arrival at or relationship to that destination. Even the gags that deny the family, the couch that puts something else there, that make the couch inaccessible, that substitute some other resolution for the standard pile onto the couch conclusion, are organized around the absence of the destination rather than the presence of an alternative one. The couch defines the gag even when the gag is about its non-presence. This is the show's emotional logic encoded in its most variable element. Whatever happens, the family tries to get home. The couch is home. The episode begins when they arrive. 36 years of openings, all ending at the same place. Because the story The Simpsons tells is always fundamentally the same story. A family trying to get home and getting there, and what happens after they do. Section 3 continued. The invisible audience. There is a question worth sitting with as you accumulate all of this information about the backgrounds of The Simpsons. Who was this made for? Not in the philosophical sense, not as an abstract inquiry into the ethics of hidden content, in the practical sense. The bookshelf joke that requires reading 3 shelf levels in the background of a scene, the fine print on the billboard, the hospital walls with accurate anatomy, the cemetery with its graves for unnamed characters, the grocery store shelves with episode-specific product labels. All of this was made by people who knew it would be seen, if it was seen at all, by a very small number of people examining the show in ways most people never would. The audience for most of this content is tiny. It may in some cases have been, until digital playback and freeze frame capability became available, effectively zero content placed in backgrounds that could not have been examined in real time, with the technology of the period in which it was made. So, who were the background artists and writers and directors making this content for? The most honest answer is probably for themselves. For the satisfaction of making something correctly. For the pleasure of knowing that something specific is in the background even if nobody finds it. For the professional culture of the production, in which the standard of care applied to backgrounds was simply the same standard applied to everything else, regardless of whether that standard would ever be visible to anyone outside the room. This is a specific kind of professional ethic, and it is not unusual in craft traditions that value quality for its own sake rather than for its reception. The joiner who cuts the back of a drawer, the surface nobody sees as carefully as the front. The musician who records a part buried in the mix at a level of precision that the final recording will not make audible. The chef who prepares the components of a dish with the same attention, whether those components are plated individually or combined into something where their individual quality is subsumed in the whole. The show's backgrounds are maintained at that level, not because anyone requires it, not because the audience will catch it, because the people making it don't know how to do it any other way, or because they consider the alternative backgrounds that are sloppy, backgrounds that are arbitrary, backgrounds that treat their invisibility as permission to be careless, to be simply not acceptable. This creates a specific relationship between the show and the viewer who examines it closely. The show did not know when it was made that freeze frame capability would make its backgrounds examinable at length. It did not know that digital playback would allow anyone to pause a background scene and read the bookshelf at leisure. It maintained its backgrounds at a high standard of specific care before that became possible, which means that the Easter eggs discovered by viewers with pause and examine capability were placed there before anyone could examine them. The content waited. It was in the background for years before anyone had the tools to find it there. And when the tools arrived, first home video, then DVD, then digital streaming with frame-accurate pause, the content was still there, patient as it had always been. The invisible audience had been visible all along, waiting for someone to arrive with the right kind of attention. The background of The Simpsons is a trust exercise. The production put things there before anyone could see them. The viewers who eventually found those things were discovering something that had been waiting specifically for that kind of discovery. And that relationship of content placed in expectation of an eventual audience that did not yet exist is itself the most interesting thing about the show's hidden content practice. It is not advertising. It is not promotion. It is not fan service in the usual sense of the term, because it predates the fan communities that would eventually engage with it. It is something closer to an act of faith, the belief that someone, eventually, would look at the background, would read the shelf, would check what the television is playing, would count the lines on the chalkboard, would examine the tombstone inscriptions, would listen to the 4-second saxophone riff and register it as unique. The show's hidden content practice is a bet on human curiosity, placed decades in advance and paid out incrementally as new viewers have acquired new tools and applied them to the same material that has been sitting in the background all along. The payouts are still happening. The backgrounds of episodes from the show's earliest seasons are still being examined with tools that did not exist when those episodes were made. Things are still being found. The archive is not fully cataloged, and the archive keeps expanding, season by season, as the show continues to add new backgrounds to its permanent record. Section 4 continued. The chalkboard as social document. The chalkboard sentences of The Simpsons are usually discussed as a comedy tradition, which they are. But across 36 years of weekly production, the chalkboard has also become something sociological, a record of what American society considered acceptable to tell children not to do, week by week across more than 3 decades. This sounds like an overwrought claim until you read the sentences in chronological sequence. The earliest chalkboard sentences are simple behavioral corrections. Do not skateboard in the halls. Do not burp in class. Do not draw class pictures in church. These are the sentences of a show whose moral landscape is domestic and institutional. The rules being enforced are the rules of school and church and family, legible to any viewer in any American community. As the seasons progress, the sentences evolve. They become more culturally specific. They address things that are recognizable only to viewers in certain positions, viewers who share certain cultural contexts. A sentence about not torturing a specific kind of creature reflects a specific cultural moment's concern about specific kinds of animal welfare. A sentence about not doing something with a specific kind of technology reflects the arrival of that technology in the cultural conversation. A sentence about a political figure or a specific public controversy dates the episode as precisely as a dateline on a newspaper article. Reading the chalkboard archive as a sociological document, what you find is a timeline of what American public discourse decided was important enough to address through a cartoon punishment in a specific week. The show is a product of specific people at a specific production company making specific decisions, but those decisions are shaped by the cultural environment those people inhabit. The chalkboard is the most time-stamped surface of that cultural environment, the part of the show that was written closest to broadcast, requiring the least production time between decision and screen, and therefore the most responsive to whatever was happening in the culture at the moment of its production. The sentence, "I will not use abrev," from an early season is a small joke about linguistic laziness, barely culturally specific. The sentence, "The cafeteria deep fryer is not a toy," from a later season, implies a specific national conversation about deep frying and food safety that was happening at the moment of its production. The sentence, "Beans are neither magical nor musical," implies something about what children were being exposed to in their cultural environment at a specific moment. Each sentence is not just a joke. Each sentence is a data point in a 36-year survey of what the American production culture considered important enough to put in the background of a cartoon, in the language of school punishment, in the most visible 2 inches of the opening sequence. The cryptic sentences deserve this additional consideration. They may not be cryptic at all to the right person. A sentence that no external viewer has been able to connect to any identifiable reference might be immediately legible to anyone who was in the writer's room in the week it was written, who knows what the production was dealing with that week, what interpersonal dynamics were unfolding, what creative arguments were being had, what was on the television in the break room, what someone said at lunch that made enough people laugh that it ended up in the chalkboard slot. These are the sentences that exist most purely inside the production. They were not written for the audience at all, not even for the attentive freeze-frame audience. They were written by people who were in a room together and found something funny that was too specific to their own situation to translate. The chalkboard sentence as pure, inside joke hidden not in the background of a shot, but in the unreachable privacy of the room where the show was made. And that distinction matters. It suggests that not all of the show's hidden content is intended to be found eventually. Some of it was never intended for any audience outside the production. It was hidden in the most visible part of the opening, where it would be seen and read by millions of people, none of whom would be able to access it. hidden in plain sight in the deepest possible way, in a place where everyone could see it but nobody could read it. The chalkboard sentence in that category is not an Easter egg. It is something else. A message from inside the production that will never be received, written in the format of the most public possible text, addressed to an audience that does not exist. There is something strange and quiet about that, sitting in the middle of the most visible 30 seconds of the most watched animated show in history. Section 5 continued. The guest star as mirror. The guest star tradition in The Simpsons does something that guest appearances in other long-running shows rarely attempt. It uses the guest's real-world significance to produce meaning inside the show's fictional world without ever acknowledging that the guest's real-world significance is being used. This requires unpacking. In most television shows that use celebrity guests, the guest's fame is the joke or the plot element. The character is famous. The characters in the show are aware of the famous character. The episode derives its energy from the interaction between the show's regular world and the famous person's presence in it. The guest is used as a guest. The Simpsons does this too. Many of its guest appearances work exactly in these terms. But in a significant subset of appearances, something more interesting is happening. The guest appears not as themselves or as a character whose fame is plot relevant, but as a character in Springfield whose connection to the episode's themes comes entirely from what the viewer knows about the real person knowledge. The episode itself never activates. The episode is not about this person's real-world significance. The character they play has no direct connection to their biography, but the real person's biography and the episode's themes are in conversation for the viewer who brings that biography to the viewing. The episode is doing two things simultaneously: telling a story to viewers who know nothing about the guest, and telling a more resonant story to viewers who bring full knowledge of who is in the room. This is a technique that requires the show's writers to be selecting guests not just for their voice or their fame or their willingness to participate, but for the specific quality of their real-world significance relative to the specific episode's themes. Someone is asking, who would add a layer to this story that the episode itself cannot state directly, and then casting that person? The sophistication of this practice is invisible if you do not have the knowledge of the guest's biography. The episode works completely without it. The additional layer is genuinely additional. It does not alter the surface story, but it deepens it for the viewer who arrives with the relevant context. This is the guest star at the level of literature rather than entertainment. The character whose presence in a scene adds connotations derived from outside the fictional world, expanding the scene's meaning for readers who bring those connotations while leaving it complete for readers who do not. The show also uses the guest star tradition to comment on its own relationship to celebrity. Springfield is a town that has hosted hundreds of famous visitors across 36 years, and the town's relationship to those visitors is instructive. Springfield is overwhelmed by celebrities. It is easily starstruck. It treats famous people with a kind of reverence that real communities often do, immediately subordinating its own values and judgment to the simple fact of someone being famous. And then the celebrity leaves and Springfield forgets they were there. The town's relationship to celebrity mirrors the culture's relationship to celebrity in a way that the show makes explicit in individual episodes, but that is also visible in the aggregate of the full guest star archive. Hundreds of famous visitors, barely any of them remembered in subsequent episodes. The town is endlessly fascinated by fame and endlessly incapable of being changed by it. The celebrity comes, the episode happens, and Springfield returns to itself as if the famous person's presence had left no mark, which is, in its own way, the most honest thing about Springfield's relationship to the wider world. The world comes to Springfield. Springfield watches with attention. And then Springfield resets, because that is what Springfield does. And the famous visitor joins the long archive of things that happened in this town and were forgotten by the next episode. Section 6 continued. What the buildings know. The architecture of Springfield holds knowledge that the residents of Springfield do not have and cannot access. This is a strange formulation for a cartoon town, but it is worth sitting with, because it is true in a specific sense. The buildings of Springfield have been maintaining a record of the show's history in the objects that persist in their interiors, in the design evolution of their exteriors, in the accumulated sediment of 36 years of production decisions that no single resident of Springfield could hold in their head. The town remembers things its people cannot. Homer's basement is the clearest example of this. The basement has been visited in dozens of episodes across the show's run, and each visit reveals objects that connect to previous visits and previous episodes. The cumulative content of the Simpson basement is a three-dimensional archive of Homer's enthusiasms and failures across 36 years. Some of the basement objects belong to plots the show has never resolved projects. Homer started and abandoned, equipment for ventures that were introduced but not concluded, props that reference things the main narrative has never followed up on. The basement knows more than Homer does about Homer's history. The objects know more than their owner about where they came from and what they were meant for. The house holds a history that its inhabitants have forgotten. This mirrors something the show does at the level of its overall structure. Springfield has a history that its residents cannot access. Events that happened and were forgotten. Consequences that arrived and were ignored. The town has been through things that have left no mark on its people, but that are documented in its buildings and signs and background details. The buildings are what Springfield's collective denial has suppressed. They hold the evidence of what happened, what the water was poured into, which basements were found to contain unexpected things, which corridors were discovered to have bones, which parking lots had accidents that were quietly resolved, while the people who live inside and around them have agreed to stop looking at the walls too closely. The architecture of Springfield is the show's archive. It persists, it accumulates, it does not participate in the collective forgetting that makes Springfield's impossible stasis maintainable. And for the viewer who is looking at the buildings rather than the people, it offers a version of Springfield's history that the town itself has decided is too dangerous to hold. Section 7 continued. Reading what Springfield posted. The signs and storefronts of Springfield have a specific relationship to time that no other element of the show quite replicates. Because the show uses a floating timeline, the year always being the year of broadcast, the characters never aging. The text in Springfield's commercial environment is always contemporary. The billboards always advertise current things. The menu prices reflect the current period. The storefronts are current businesses serving current needs with current language and current graphic design. Except the show has been running for 36 years, which means that the commercial signage of Springfield across its full archive is a record of what current looked like across 3.5 decades, what current advertising language sounded like, what current prices were, what businesses existed and served what functions and communicated themselves in what terms, what the visual grammar of commercial communication was in different periods of the show's run. The store name puns from the early 90s are not the same kind of puns as the store name puns from recent seasons. The advertising copy on the early season billboards uses rhetorical conventions from that era's advertising. The menu boards from different periods of the show's run use different graphic design conventions, different typography, different organizational logic. Springfield's commercial signage is read across the full archive, a visual history of American commercial culture across 36 years. This is not its primary purpose, and it was not designed with this in mind. But it is what the archive produces, the incidental documentary function of a show that has been reflecting its own cultural moment in its background text for 3.5 decades. There is also a specifically interesting category of commercial Easter egg, the business that exists for one episode and then never appears again, but whose name and description, taken seriously as a real business in the real Springfield, would require explanation. Springfield has hosted, across its history, a remarkable number of businesses whose existence raises questions that no episode addresses, services for needs that do not exist in a normal community, products for situations that should never arise, establishments whose names imply histories that the show has never told, stores whose specialization is so narrow that their economic viability in a medium-sized town is implausible even by the relaxed standards of a cartoon community. These businesses exist for the duration of the gag that requires them. They are not developed further. But within the logic of a town that the viewer is asked to take seriously as a real place, a consistent world with consistent rules and consistent histories, their existence implies things. They imply a Springfield that has needs and problems and economic niches that the show has not bothered to explain. Visible in the storefronts, the show drops into its backgrounds without comment. The business that exists for one episode and is never referenced again is also the show's version of a short story that does not resolve, a premise introduced in a background detail, the implications of which are left for the viewer to pursue, with no narrative that follows up on what the premise implies. The background has more stories in it than the show will ever tell. The storefronts are the most visible surface of that untold archive. Section 8 continued. Violence as commentary. The Itchy and Scratchy shorts have a relationship to their historical moment that deepens when you read them in sequence across the show's run. The violence in Itchy and Scratchy is not constant in its character, it changes. The specific quality of the violence, the tools it uses, the scale at which it operates, the speed and rhythm of its delivery, has evolved across 36 years in ways that track changes in what violence looked like in American entertainment more broadly. Early Itchy and Scratchy violence belongs to the Looney Tunes tradition, physical, exaggerated, consequence-free in the specific way that classic cartoon violence is consequence-free. It is funny in the immediate register of cartoon slapstick, without dwelling on what the violence means or what it produces beyond the spectacle of itself. The show is parodying something it is also, at that moment, participating in. Later, Itchy and Scratchy violence is different in character. It is more extreme at the level of content, more specific in what body does to body, more interested in dwelling at the moment of impact rather than cutting away from it. But it is also more self-aware. It knows it is extreme. It is commenting on the fact of its extremity rather than simply being extreme. The parody has internalized its own status as parody and begun parodying parody itself. This is a reflection of what happened to animated violence in American entertainment across the same period. The genre became self-aware. The extremity became the subject. The cartoon violence that in 1990 was straightforward slapstick had, by 2010, become a category that was commenting on itself in practically every execution. The Itchy and Scratchy archive is a history of American animated violence's relationship to its own escalation. Viewed in sequence, it is a documentary about the genre made entirely inside the genre it documents, using the genre's own tools to demonstrate how those tools have changed. The children watching Itchy and Scratchy in the show's universe watch all of this without any of these distinctions. They watch because it is funny and immediate and viscerally satisfying. The analytical layer is not for Bart and Lisa. It is for the viewer who is watching both the children and the show within the show, simultaneously inside and outside the viewing experience, holding both the immediate register and the critical register at once. Which is to say, the critical layer is for the same viewer who reads the bookshelf and examines the cemetery and counts the chalkboard lines and listens to the 4-second saxophone riff. The viewer who watches The Simpsons from both inside and outside at the same time. Section 9 continued. The Halloween canon. There is a version of The Simpsons that exists only in the Treehouse of Horror archive. Across 34 years of Halloween specials, the non-canonical content of The Simpsons has been building a parallel Springfield. A Springfield where the rules are different, where death is negotiable, where the impossible is structural rather than exceptional, where the characters are free to reveal aspects of themselves that the main show's continuity prohibits. In the main show, Homer's nature is fixed. He is what he is. The narrative cannot permanently change him because permanently changing him would change what the show is. But in a Treehouse of Horror episode, Homer can become something fundamentally different. He has become a monster, a villain, a ghost, a victim of transformation so complete that it produces a version of Homer that could not exist in the regular show without destroying it. These transformations happen, they are complete, and then they are canceled by the non-canonical frame that the specials operate within. What the Halloween canon offers is a view of who the characters might be if the regular show's constraints were removed, if consequences stuck, if transformation were permanent, if the reset that the main show deploys at the end of every episode did not apply. In that sense, the Treehouse of Horror specials are the show's unconscious. The main show is what Springfield's residents agree to experience. The Halloween specials are what Springfield's residents would experience if the agreement broke down. If the collective forgetting failed for 1 week, and the impossible things stayed impossible instead of resolving back into the possible. The Easter eggs in the Halloween specials that point to the main show's deepest concerns are most visible in this light. The moments where a Halloween segment depicts something that the main show has been approaching for years, but has never allowed itself to address directly. The horror registering, in exaggerated form, the actual situation of Springfield that the main show handles through comedy. The episodes where Burns appears as a monster in the Halloween canon are the ones most worth examining through this lens. Burns as monster in the Treehouse of Horror is Burns as what he is in the main show, scaled up to a visual vocabulary that makes the nature of the thing visible without the comedy frame that the main show requires. The Halloween Burns is not a more extreme version of the regular Burns. He is the regular Burns made explicit in a register that leaves no ambiguity about what kind of figure this is. The same is true of Homer in the Halloween episodes, where his quality of indestructibility, his ability to survive everything, to recover from anything, to persist through circumstances that would end any normal person, becomes the literal content of the special, rather than a background condition of the show. The Halloween Homer who cannot die is not a horror version of Homer. He is the main show's Homer with the horror made visible. The show has been making this joke for 36 years in the main canon. The Halloween special is the moment where the joke drops the comedy frame and you can see what the joke has always been about. The treehouse of horror episodes are the show's self-awareness at its most concentrated. The main show knows what it is and maintains the comedy frame that makes that knowledge sustainable. The Halloween specials are the moments when the frame is temporarily suspended and the knowledge is stated directly in the register of horror, using the grammar of the genre that exists specifically to make visible the things that other genres suppress. Section 10 continued. The score as memory. There is something specific about the way the score of The Simpsons functions in relation to the show's history that deserves extended consideration. Television scoring is typically invisible. It is designed to support the visual and emotional content of a scene without drawing attention to itself. The successful television score is the one the viewer does not consciously register as music. It is simply the emotional register of the scene, delivered through sound rather than announced as a separate element. The Simpsons score is usually successful in exactly these terms. Most viewers have watched hundreds of episodes without forming a conscious impression of the music accompanying them. The score is in the air of Springfield the way background sound is in the air of any real environment present, contributing to the atmosphere, but not the object of attention. But for the viewer who chooses to listen to the score, rather than simply through it, the music of The Simpsons is a map of the show's emotional history. The character themes function as mnemonic anchors. Hearing a character's theme outside that character's presence is a moment of displacement. The music is triggering a memory or an association or an expectation that the visual is not providing. The theme says, "This scene is about this character, even though this character is not in it." This moment connects to that character's story, even though the scene does not announce the connection. This is the leitmotif at its most useful. Not just identifying who is present, but creating invisible structural connections across the show's episodes. Moments in Season 15 that are in conversation with moments in Season 6, the conversation audible only in the score that connects them. The viewer who has internalized the character themes enough to hear them in their secondary and tertiary applications is experiencing a version of The Simpsons with a denser network of internal connections than is visible to the viewer. Hearing the music only as background support. The specific emotional quality of the score also shifts across the show's history in ways that track the show's tonal evolution. The early seasons have a score with a specific quality of warmth, a particular combination of harmonic choices and orchestral color that belongs to the period and to the show's original emotional register as working class. Domestic comedy. Later seasons have a score that reflects the show's expanded ambitions and changed tonal relationship to its own subject. The music of recent seasons is not the music of the first few seasons, and the difference is not just production style. It is the record of the show changing what it is about, changing how it feels about its own characters, changing its relationship to the world it was built to describe. The score knows what the show has become. It carries that knowledge in its orchestration and its harmonic choices and its specific textures, available to the listener who has been paying attention long enough to hear the distance between where the music started and where it is now. Section 11 continued. The writers as ghosts. The writers of The Simpsons have a peculiar relationship to their own work. They made it. Their names are in the credits. Their voices are audible in the scripts to anyone who has read enough of their other work or listened to enough of their commentary to know what each voice sounds like. And they are, in the experience of watching the show, invisible. This invisibility is the condition of all television writing. The writer's product passes through layers of production. It is spoken by voice actors, animated by artists, shaped by directors, altered by editors before it arrives on screen as the shared product of many hands. The original writer's specific contribution is subsumed into the larger whole. What reaches the viewer is something that belongs to nobody in particular, or rather belongs to a collective whose internal dynamics and individual contributions are not visible in the finished product. The Easter egg tradition, the Simpsons writers have maintained their names in backgrounds, their voices in specific moments of dialogue, their personal concerns running through the shows they wrote is, among other things, a way of persisting in their own product, a way of remaining present in something that the production process would otherwise make anonymous. This is not vanity in the usual sense. It is closer to the professional tradition of the stonemason who carved their signature into the underside of a cathedral gargoyle, where it would be invisible for centuries to anyone who did not know to look for it. Visible when found, hidden in the specific position where only someone looking for it would ever encounter it. Present in the work in a way that the work's intended function does not require and its audience will not notice. The writers' names in the backgrounds of The Simpsons are signatures in exactly this tradition. Not claiming authorship, the credits do that, but persisting in the work in a way that the credits do not provide. The credit is a formal acknowledgement. The name on a background tombstone, on a background business sign, on a background locker number is something else. It is the writer inside the world they made, looking out from within the thing they built rather than being listed alongside it. There is also a specific category of writer's room Easter egg that has accumulated across the show's long collaborative history. References that only make sense within a specific writer's room at a specific moment, referencing things that happened in the room rather than in the culture outside it. The writer's room is a specific kind of social environment. A group of people spending extended periods of time together, making something, generating enormous quantities of material, most of which will never appear in the show, developing private jokes and references, and a shorthand that belongs only to the group. Long-running shows develop writers' room cultures that have their own histories and mythologies and running jokes that are as specific and as private as any small community's shared culture. Some of that culture finds its way into the show, not as deliberate Easter eggs, but as overflow things from the room that are funny enough in their original context to persist in some encoded form in the content the room produces. A reference that means something specific to the people who were in the room when it was coined, and that means something else, or something less, or simply something funny without specific meaning, to the viewer who encounters it in the show's content. These are the Easter eggs that cannot be decoded by any amount of careful examination by external viewers. They belong to a context that has never been fully documented, and that can only be accessed by the people who were present. The show has hundreds of these across 36 years of production moments of content that are visible to everyone and legible only to the people who were in the room when the content was made. This is the deepest layer of hidden content in The Simpsons. Content hidden not in the background of a shot, but in the history of the production that made the shot. Hidden in the social context that the finished product emerges from and that the finished product does not represent. Available only to participants. Inaccessible to any audience. The writer's room is the one background that the viewer can never examine. It is the original context for everything in the show, and it is the one thing the show can never show. Section 12 continued, what the archive has become. 36 years is a long time for any creative work to accumulate. Most television shows do not run long enough to develop the relationship to their own history that The Simpsons has. A show that runs 5 or 7 or 10 seasons produces an archive. A show that runs 36 produces something different. A world. A body of content large enough to contain contradictions, to have evolved through multiple distinct phases, to have layers of production history that do not all know about each other, to have developed traditions and then abandoned them and then revived them, and then allowed them to develop in new directions. The Easter egg archive of The Simpsons is a product of this specific kind of longevity. No individual season of the show, however richly furnished with hidden content, would produce the kind of archive that now exists. The archive is what happens when the practice of hiding things in backgrounds is maintained consistently across 3.5 decades and nearly 800 episodes. Individual gags become traditions. Individual traditions become institutions. Individual institutions become the invisible architecture of the show's world, the things that have always been there, and that the production maintains without anyone being required to explain why. The tomb inscriptions in the cemetery are the clearest example of this. Nobody is required to maintain those inscriptions. No viewer is required to read them. They were put there at some point and they persist because nobody removed them, and because the background team that inherited the cemetery's visual design inherited the convention of inscriptions, along with the visual grammar. The inscriptions are part of what the cemetery is, within the production's collective understanding of the show's world. Removing them would be conspicuous. Maintaining them is simply what you do. This is how traditions without authors form. Someone made a decision at some point. The decision was incorporated into the production's collective understanding of the relevant element. New people joining the production learned the element as it was with the inscriptions, with the product in the corner of the quick E-Mart shelf, with the unique saxophone riff in the opening hallway, and perpetuated it without necessarily knowing its origin or understanding its full significance. The tradition became invisible in the transmission, present as practice without requiring justification or explanation. The result is a show that has, in its 36th year, hidden content in its backgrounds that nobody currently working on it may be able to fully account for. Content that belongs to the show's history in a more specific sense than any currently working production team member's tenure. Content that is maintained because it has always been there, which is the deepest form of institutional knowledge there is. This is also why the Easter egg archive of The Simpsons is genuinely irreplaceable. Not because the content is extraordinary on a case-by-case basis. Many individual Easter eggs, examined in isolation, are modest. A funny book title, a callback on a background tombstone, a unique 4-second musical phrase. The archive is irreplaceable because it is a product of 36 years of continuous production by a specific community of people working in a specific tradition. No new project could begin and produce, in 5 or 10 years, what The Simpsons has accumulated. The archive is the product of time, specifically. And the archive keeps growing. Every new episode adds new backgrounds. Every new couch gag adds new content to the most experimentally free slot in the show's format. Every new chalkboard sentence adds a new entry to the diary. Every new season adds new objects to Homer's basement, and new names to the background crowd, and new content to the quick E-Mart shelves. The show is still being made. The archive is still accumulating. The things that will be found in 20 years are being placed in backgrounds right now, in episodes that have not yet aired, by background artists and writers and directors working in the same tradition that has been producing discoverable content since 1989. What you find when you look at the archive, really look at it, is not a show that has been hiding secrets. It is a show that has been paying attention to itself, consistently and in detail, for 36 years. Treating every corner of its own world as worth the care of making it specific. Trusting that someone, eventually, would look. The trust was not misplaced. A note on the experience of watching with this knowledge. There is a question worth addressing before the end, and it is the question that viewers who have spent time in the archive tend to eventually ask themselves. Does knowing all of this make watching The Simpsons better? The honest answer is, differently. Watching The Simpsons without this knowledge is an experience organized around the foreground, the characters, the story, the jokes and the dialogue, the emotional moments in the main narrative. The show is, by that measure, one of the richest comedies ever produced, capable of emotional depth that has surprised generations of viewers who arrived expecting only laughs. Watching with this knowledge introduces a second track of experience. The viewer who knows about the backgrounds is watching two versions of the same show simultaneously. The foreground show everyone watches and the background show that exists in the margins of every frame. The two shows are in conversation. They are not the same show, but they are related in the specific way that a text and its annotations are related. The annotation does not replace the text. It accompanies it, and the experience of the annotated text is richer for most readers than the experience of the text alone. Some viewers find this second track distracting. Knowing there is something in the background can redirect attention away from the story at moments when the story is what matters. The freeze frame impulse, the urge to pause and examine backgrounds, rather than watching the scene proceed, can interrupt emotional engagement with main narrative content in ways that damage the experience rather than enriching it. Other viewers find that the second track deepens their relationship to the show in ways that no amount of additional foreground content could achieve. The discovery of specific content in a specific background creates a specific pleasure. The pleasure of finding something that was hidden, of making a connection that required specific knowledge and specific attention to make, of sharing a private moment with a production that made something for you specifically, even though they did not know who you specifically were when they made it. The show does not tell you which kind of viewer to be. It produced the foreground show, and it produced the background show, and it trusts that viewers will find their own relationship to both. 36 years of hidden content and backgrounds that nobody is required to examine, maintained for viewers who may not exist yet, addressed to a future audience with future tools and future levels of attention that the production could not have fully anticipated. The invitation is open. The backgrounds are there. The saxophone riff is different this week from last week. The cemetery inscriptions are waiting. The bookshelf is stocked with specific titles. The church bulletin board has been updated. Springfield is paying attention. The question is always whether anyone is paying attention back. The quiet accumulation. Small details that earn long attention. It is worth spending some time not on the category of Easter egg, but on the individual. Because the archive is made of individual things, specific details placed in specific episodes by specific people. And some of those individual details deserve to be named on their own terms rather than being subsumed into categories. The mailbox on the house 2 doors from The Simpsons on Evergreen Terrace that appeared in a Season 3 background and has had the same name on it in subsequent appearances when that section of the street has been visible. A name that corresponds to a secondary character who was given that address in a throwaway line in an early episode. The mailbox remembers the character's address even though the character has never been seen entering or leaving that house. The clock in The Simpsons kitchen. It has appeared in many kitchen scenes across the show's history. The time it shows has been consistent enough across enough kitchen scenes to produce, in the fan community, an extended debate about whether the kitchen clock is always showing the same time, whether that time has significance, and whether the significance, if any exists, connects to anything in the show's established world. The debate has not been resolved. The clock continues to appear in kitchen scenes. Whatever time it shows continues to be whatever it is. The photograph on the mantelpiece above the Simpsons' living room fireplace. The fireplace itself is a detail. The Simpsons house was initially designed without one, and the fireplace appeared at some point in the show's visual development without being announced. The photograph on its mantelpiece has been visible in various configurations across the seasons. The image in the photograph, identifiable in high-resolution freeze frame, has been interpreted differently by different viewers. There is no confirmed reading of what the photograph shows. The number of donuts in the box Homer opens in a specific early season episode. The number corresponds, when examined, to a number that appears in 3 other contexts in the same episode. Nobody has confirmed whether this is deliberate counting or coincidence observed by attentive viewers. The specific configuration of Flanders' family photographs visible through the Flanders' living room window in background shots of Evergreen Terrace exterior scenes. The photographs have been visible often enough across the show's run to constitute a datable visual record of how the Flanders family was conceived to have been at different points in the show's history. These are the small details. Not the systems, not the traditions, not the 36-year practices, just things. Specific things placed by specific people in specific moments of the show's production. Some with specific intent and some as natural choices, all of them now part of the permanent visual record of a town that has been built and maintained for 3.5 decades. The archive of The Simpsons is made of these. Of small things accumulated across 36 years into something that no single mind could hold. The total is larger than any of its parts. The tradition is larger than any individual entry in the tradition. The world the show built is larger than any episode or any season or any phase of the show's history. That is what the archive has become. That is what 36 years of specific, careful, consistent attention to backgrounds produces, when the people doing the work treat every corner of their world as worth the care of making it specific. The corners are specific. They have always been specific. Go look. The long view. What Springfield looks like from outside time. There is a final way to look at the Easter egg archive of The Simpsons that has not yet been addressed, and it is the one that produces the most quietly profound result. If you step back far enough from the individual Easter eggs far enough to see not the specific details but the practice itself, the 36-year commitment to hidden content across every episode, in every corner, for an audience that was not required to exist, what you see is a production culture making a specific argument about what making things is for. The argument is this: the thing you make is worth more than the audience that will see it. Not because the audience is unimportant. The show was made for an audience. It was designed to be watched and enjoyed and to connect with the people who watched it. None of that is incidental. But the content hidden in the backgrounds, the content that required the same care as the foreground content, that was produced with the same attention, that was maintained with the same consistency, but that was placed where the vast majority of the audience would never encounter it. That content is evidence that the production was making something whose value was not entirely determined by how many people would find it. The hospital walls with accurate anatomy. The 4-second saxophone riff, unique every week. The names in the backgrounds of crowd scenes. The book titles on the shelves. The cemetery inscriptions for characters who never existed in any episode. All of it made correctly. All of it maintained carefully. Most of it never found by anyone outside the production team that created it. This is a specific kind of seriousness about the work. A seriousness that locates the value of the thing made partly in the thing itself, rather than entirely in its reception. The corner nobody looks at is still worth making correctly, not because someone might eventually look, but because making it correctly is what it means to do this work the right way. The Simpsons has been making the background correctly for 36 years. The corners have been earning their care. And the viewers who look at the background, who read the shelves and count the lines and listen to the riff, those viewers are not finding content that was hidden from them. They are finding content that was made for them specifically, in the sense that it was made for the kind of attention they bring, not for any individual viewer, but for the practice of close attention itself. That is the final Easter egg, not a specific image or a specific number or a specific musical quotation, the practice. The sustained commitment across 36 years and nearly 800 episodes to making the background as carefully as the foreground, for an audience whose existence was an act of faith rather than a certainty. The faith was justified. Here you are. Thank you for being here for all of this. Wherever you are in the world and whatever time it is, drop it in the comments. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing people in different places and different hours are in the same space, thinking about the same town. Subscribe if you want to keep going. And whenever you next watch an episode of The Simpsons, any episode, from any season, look at the background. Just for a moment. See what is there. It has been waiting for you specifically. Good night from Springfield. End. Extended exploration. Going deeper into Springfield's hidden world. What follows is an extended examination of specific moments, specific episodes, and specific categories of hidden content that deserve more space than the preceding sections were able to give them. These are the details that reward the slow reader, the patient viewer, the person who is in no particular hurry to get to the end of something. This section is for them. The specific problem of the Simpsons house. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace has been on American television since 1989. Its yellow exterior, its 2-car garage, its front porch with the specific window configuration above it, its modest suburban lot on a street of similar-looking houses. These visual facts are among the most recognized domestic spaces in the history of American media. What is interesting about The Simpsons house is not its recognizability, but what happens to its interior when you track it carefully across the show's full run. The interior of the house is spatially impossible. This is not controversial. The show itself has acknowledged the impossibility at various points, and the spatial inconsistency of the house's interior layout has been documented in fan discussions for decades. The hallway is longer when it needs to be longer. The bathroom is where the story requires it to be. The basement stairs appear in positions relative to the kitchen and living room that are inconsistent between episodes. The backyard, visible through the kitchen window in some episodes, is inconsistent in its geography with what the back of the house looks like from outside in other episodes. These inconsistencies are usually attributed to the necessities of storytelling. The house is as big as the joke requires it to be. And expecting consistent interior architecture from an animated show is a category error. This is true, but it misses something about how the inconsistencies function. The Simpsons house is spatially flexible precisely because the house is not primarily a physical object in this show. It is an emotional space. It is the container for the family's life together. It is whatever size and shape the family's emotional needs require at any given moment. When Homer needs to be alone, there is a space for him to be alone in. When the family needs to be together, the living room accommodates them. When Bart needs an escape route, there is a window or a staircase at the right position for escaping. The house is responsive to the story in a way that real houses are not. And this responsiveness, which reads as spatial inconsistency if you are trying to map the house as an architectural object, reads as emotional intelligence if you are thinking about what the house is for. The Easter eggs embedded in the house's interior are not consistent with any fixed layout. They are consistent with a house that organizes itself according to what the moment needs. The photograph on the wall that connects to an earlier episode appears in the correct position for whatever scene it appears in, regardless of whether that position is consistent with its position in previous scenes. The object in Homer's basement that references a failed project appears when the scene requires a reference to that failure, not necessarily in the same corner of the basement it occupied in the previous basement scene. The house's hidden content does not follow the logic of a consistent physical space. It follows the logic of a space that exists primarily as memory and emotional territory, where the physical can rearrange itself to serve the moment. Which is, if you are willing to follow the logic, exactly how memory actually works. Not as a consistent spatial archive, but as a flexible, emotionally organized repository where things appear when they are relevant, rather than always occupying fixed locations. The Simpsons house is a memory palace, loosely constructed, emotionally navigated, containing specific hidden things that appear when the right kind of attention creates the conditions for their appearance. It is consistent not spatially, but emotionally. Its hidden content is accessible not through a map, but through the willingness to be present to what a specific moment in the house's emotional history is making available. The problem of what gets forgotten and what doesn't. The Simpsons has a famous relationship to forgetting. Episode to episode, the show resets. Consequences that should persist do not. Things that happened last week have not happened in the universe the current episode occupies. Springfield's collective memory is notoriously short. But the Easter egg tradition represents the opposite of forgetting. The Easter egg tradition is the show's memory system. It is the place where the show does remember, where it maintains specific callbacks to specific moments across decades, where it quietly acknowledges the things that happened before, where it treats the past as something worth preserving in the margins of the present. This is a productive contradiction. The main show forgets, the backgrounds remember, the characters reset, the hidden content persists. Springfield's residents cannot hold their own history. The show's background artists and writers maintain that history in the corners where the residents will never look. The forgetting and the remembering are both true of The Simpsons simultaneously. The show forgets in its foreground and remembers in its background. The characters cannot hold what has happened. The background can and does. This suggests that the Easter egg tradition is not incidental to what The Simpsons is. It is the show's response to its own formal limitations, the episodic reset, the floating timeline, the inability to allow its characters to grow or age or be permanently changed by what happens to them. The background holds what the foreground cannot. The hidden content is the show's permanent record. The Easter egg is what remains after the characters forget. The specific satisfaction of the discovered Easter egg. There is a moment that everyone who has spent significant time with The Simpsons' hidden content archive has experienced, and it is worth trying to describe because it is a specific kind of pleasure that most discussions of Easter eggs treat as too obvious to examine. You are watching an episode. You have seen this episode before, or you are watching it for the first time. Your attention drifts to the background, to the shelves, to the sign on the wall, to the newspaper on the counter, to the items in the cart, and you see something. Something specific, something that means something, a connection you were not expecting, a reference you were not looking for, a detail that was placed there by someone for you to find at exactly this moment, even though they did not know when this moment would come or who would be in it. The pleasure of that moment is not the pleasure of solving a puzzle. Puzzles have solutions that end the puzzle. This is not like that. The discovered Easter egg does not conclude anything. It opens something. It reveals that the show contains more than you were accessing. It is evidence that the relationship between you and this show is richer than you thought it was. There is also a specific quality of intimacy in the discovered Easter egg. The content was placed for someone with this specific kind of attention. Someone made a decision to put a specific book title on a specific shelf, to compose a specific riff for a specific 4-second shot, to inscribe a specific name on a specific background tombstone. And that decision was addressed to the viewer, who would redirect their attention from the foreground to the background at exactly the right moment. The decision was addressed to you. Not to you personally, not knowing who you are, but to the kind of attention you are choosing to bring. The show was waiting for this kind of attention. You have been watching this show for however many years you have been watching it, and now you are in the position the background was made for. The Easter egg is not just a discovery. It is the moment the show recognizes you as the viewer it was also making things for. This is an unusual relationship for a television show to have with its audience. Most television is designed for one kind of attention, the forward-moving, story-following, character-tracking attention that the foreground requires. The Simpsons is designed for that and also for something else. For the attention that stops and looks at the shelf. For the attention that notices the television in the background is playing something specific. For the attention that reads the fine print on the billboard rather than moving on. Both audiences are watching the same show. Both have valid experiences of it. But only one is in the relationship the Easter egg tradition requires. Only one is the viewer the background was made for. If you have been in that relationship with this show, if you have been the kind of viewer who reads the shelf and listens to the riff and examines the cemetery and counts the chalkboard lines, then the show has been in that relationship with you. It has been making things for you specifically in every episode since before you started watching. The backgrounds were there before you arrived. They will be there when you stop watching. And every time you come back to any episode, from any season, at any point in the show's 36-year run, there will be something in the background that is there for you, waiting as patiently as it has always waited, in the corner nobody is supposed to look at. The final inventory. It seems right, at the end of an extended exploration of what the backgrounds of The Simpsons contain, to try to take stock of what the practice actually amounts to across the full run of the show. 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes. Across that archive, the hidden content tradition has produced unique original music in every episode, composed for shots that will not register as unique to most listeners. A running record of real-world price and calorie inflation in the menu board of a fictional fast food restaurant. Cemetery inscriptions for characters who have never appeared in any episode. Background bookshelves carrying specific multi-level jokes available only to readers who redirect their attention from the characters to the shelves. Production codes embedded in school hallway locker numbers. Hospital walls furnished with accurate medical illustrations. Background televisions playing programming thematically connected to the episodes containing them. A church bulletin board updated weekly for 36 years. An unnamed product in the same corner of a convenience store shelf across hundreds of episodes. Photographs on Homer's workstation showing images from previous episodes. Grocery cart contents previewing plot elements. Children's drawings on classroom walls referencing earlier seasons' events. Cemetery graves belonging to unnamed characters suggesting histories the show has never told. Writers' names in the backgrounds of crowd scenes. Production dates encoded in the numerical readings on nuclear plant instruments. Couch gag backgrounds carrying callbacks to specific earlier episodes. Cross-episode visual callbacks in the Treehouse of Horror archive. Musical leitmotifs appearing in scenes where their associated characters are absent. Character-specific bookshelf contents in the backgrounds of scenes about those characters' situations. Commercial signage across 36 years constituting a history of American commercial visual culture. A house that maintains hidden objects referencing specific episodes across decades of flexible interior geography. And behind all of this, a production culture that treated every corner of its show as worth the care of making it specific, regardless of whether anyone would notice, for 36 years. This is the total. Not any individual Easter egg, but the practice itself. The commitment. The 36-year bet that someone would eventually look at the background. You are looking at it right now. On Falling Asleep to Springfield. There is something specific about watching The Simpsons late at night, when the day has wound down and the house has gone quiet and the blue light of the screen is the only light in the room. The show is familiar. It is comfortable. It has been in the cultural background for long enough that it produces, even in episodes you have never specifically seen, a feeling of arriving somewhere you already know. The voice cast. The music. The specific yellow of the characters. The structure of a Simpsons episode, the cold open, the first act problem, the second act complication, the third act that finds its way home. All of it familiar enough to be restful, specific enough to be engaging, long-running enough that there is always more of it than you have seen. The hidden content adds something to this experience. Not in the sense that you need to be actively examining backgrounds at midnight, that is not the experience being described, but in the sense that knowing the backgrounds are there, knowing the corners are maintained, knowing that the 4-second saxophone riff is different tonight from what it was last week, adds a quality of depth to the experience of watching. Springfield is a richer world when you know how much care has been taken with it. The show will be there when you come back to it. The Easter eggs will be where they have always been, patient as they have always been, in the corners nobody is looking at. The cemetery will have its inscriptions, the shelves will have their titles. The church bulletin board will have been updated. The saxophone riff will be different. Whatever time it is where you are, Springfield is the same time. The Simpsons world does not have a time zone. It exists in a permanent present that is also always 1989 and always now, simultaneously, in the specific way that only things that have been running for 36 years can be. Let the familiar theme play. Let the yellow family run to their yellow couch. Let the episode begin and the backgrounds hold what they always hold and the music carry what it always carries. And if, at some point between now and sleep, you notice something in the background that you have never noticed before, a name on a tombstone, a title on a shelf, a product in a corner, that is the show recognizing you. That is the corner you were not supposed to look at, grateful that you looked. Good night from Springfield. The lights are still on. Bonus section. The characters themselves as Easter eggs. There is a way of looking at the main characters of The Simpsons that has not yet been addressed in this exploration, a way that treats the characters themselves as Easter eggs, as encoded content, as things that carry more information than their surface presentation delivers. This is not a common way to think about characters in a long-running animated comedy. Characters in those shows tend to be treated as the stable ground from which everything else precedes, the fixed points, the known quantities, the things you understand, so that everything happening to them can be processed in relation to that understanding. The characters are not the Easter egg. The characters are what the Easter egg is about. But The Simpsons has been running long enough, and has been designed with enough internal consistency and enough layered history, that its main characters have become genuinely complex objects. They contain more information than any individual episode could fully use. Their histories are longer than any single episode needs to address. Their relationships have been through more than any episode can fully recall. The characters themselves, taken as the full accumulation of 36 seasons of development, are objects of interpretive richness that rewards the same kind of close attention that reveals things in the backgrounds. Homer Simpson, examined across his full history, is one of the most complex figures in American popular entertainment. Not because any individual moment in his history is particularly complex, but because the accumulation of 36 years of moments, the failures and the recoveries, the stupidities and the moments of unexpected grace, the loves and the fears and the specific texture of his relationship to his world produces something that exceeds the sum of its parts. Homer's relationship to his job is the place where this complexity is most visible. Homer has worked at the nuclear plant for 36 years. He has hated it consistently. He has nearly died there multiple times. He has been abused and ignored and humiliated by his employer in specific ways that the show has documented across hundreds of episodes. And he has never left. Not permanently, not finally. This can be read as a running joke. Homer's inability to improve his situation is one of the show's most reliable sources of comedy. But read differently, across the full history, it is a portrait of a specific relationship between a person and economic necessity that is more honest than most American entertainment about what keeps people in situations they would leave if leaving were actually available to them. Homer does not leave the plant because leaving the plant is not a real option. The plant is the economy of Springfield, practically speaking. The plant is Homer's family's income. The plant is the context in which Homer's identity as a provider, the thing Homer most fundamentally is, in his own self-understanding, is maintained. Leaving the plant would not just mean finding different work. It would mean becoming someone different. Someone whose relationship to his family and his community and his own self-concept would need to be rebuilt from different materials. Homer cannot leave the plant for the same reason most people cannot leave the situations that define them. Not because the situations are good, but because the situations are all they have to define themselves with. This is the Easter egg hidden in Homer's most repeated story, not in any background detail, in the pattern of the character's life across 36 years, available only to the viewer who has watched enough of it to see the pattern rather than the individual episodes. Marge Simpson's Easter egg is different and in some ways more affecting. Marge is the stable center of the show. She is the character who is most reliable, most consistent, most continuous across the full run of the series. Homer changes episode to episode. His personality and his capabilities are famously variable, adapted to what each episode requires. Bart and Lisa evolve within the constraints of the floating timeline, their characters developing across seasons even as their ages do not change. Maggie exists in her specific unresolvable condition. Burns has his immortality, Flanders has his conditioning. Marge maintains, Marge is what she is. Marge's consistency is so total that it tends to be discussed as a limitation of the character. She does not change because she is defined as the stable one, and the stable one does not get the kind of character development that comes from change. But read across the full archive. Marge's consistency is not a limitation. It is a choice. A sustained, specific choice to be the thing that stays the same when everything else changes. To be the person who comes home to. To be the fixed point from which the show can depart and to which it can always return. The Easter egg hidden in Marge's consistency is what that consistency costs. The show makes this visible in specific moments when the consistency slips slightly and you can see the effort it requires. The effort to maintain patience when patience has been exhausted. The effort to forgive when forgiveness has been extended past any reasonable limit. The effort to remain the stable center of a family that puts enormous demands on that stability across 36 years. Marge's Easter egg is in the gap between the effortless warmth she presents and the sustained effort that warmth requires. It is visible only to the viewer who has been watching long enough to have accumulated the full picture of what she has sustained. Lisa Simpson's Easter egg is the most public of the main characters and the most openly discussed, and yet it still rewards examination. Lisa is the show's conscience. She knows what is wrong. She says what is true. She pushes back against the comfortable acceptance of bad things that Springfield's collective culture relies on. She is, in the show's world, the character who is doing what the viewer who examines the backgrounds is also doing, refusing to accept the surface, insisting on looking at what is actually there. And the show consistently makes this visible as a source of suffering for Lisa. Being the person who sees clearly is, in Springfield, a condition that produces isolation and exhaustion rather than respect or progress. Lisa speaks and is ignored. Lisa resists and is overridden. Lisa sees the three-eyed fish and understands what it means, and Springfield moves on. The Easter egg in Lisa's character is in the persistence. She keeps speaking. She keeps looking. She keeps refusing to accept the comfortable version of the truth. Not because it works, it demonstrably does not work in the show's world, but because not looking is not something she is capable of. The 8-year-old who has been trying to make Springfield see itself clearly for 36 years is not a hero who changes the world. She is a person constitutionally unable to not try, in a world constitutionally resistant to her trying. The Easter egg is the specific quality of hope that persists in that condition, not optimism. Lisa has too good a view of her situation to be optimistic, something more like faithfulness. A commitment to the act of seeing clearly that does not depend on the act producing visible results. She keeps looking. The show keeps making things worth looking at. The relationship between these two facts is one of the most quietly meaningful things in The Simpsons archive, on the history of Springfield that the show has never told. There is a Springfield that exists in the gaps between episodes, a Springfield that has been doing things while the show was focused elsewhere, a Springfield whose history is implied by what we see, the aged buildings, the established institutions, the older residents who carry histories the show has never had time to tell, but that has never been the direct subject of any episode. The cemetery is the most consistent access point to this other Springfield. Its unnamed graves belong to people who lived in this town before the Simpsons arrived, before the nuclear plant was built, before the events of the earliest episodes. The town's history extends backward beyond the show's beginning, documented in headstones and in the architecture of buildings that were old when the show was new. The church, First Church of Springfield, has been standing long enough, in the visual logic of the show, to have weathered its exterior in ways that suggest significant age. Someone built that church before the Simpsons moved to Evergreen Terrace. Someone attended services there before Ned Flanders was its most devoted congregant. The history of that church's congregation across the decades before the show began is not recoverable from any episode but is implied by the age of the building. The nuclear plant is the reverse of this. Its construction was late. It came into a town that already existed, already had a church and a school and a cemetery and a downtown. Burns did not build Springfield. He built a facility in Springfield, and the facility changed Springfield, and the relationship between the plant and the town it arrived in is a history that the show has addressed in pieces across many episodes, but has never assembled into a complete account. The history of Springfield before the plant is the darkest and most interesting of the other Springfields, implied by the show's background details. What was this town? What was it for? What did people do here before the plant provided the economy and the contamination? The cemetery holds people who lived here before any of that. The church predates it. The town exists as a history that the plant arrived into and changed. And what was lost in that change is something the show has never directly addressed. It is in the backgrounds, in the aged faces of the town's oldest residents, in the buildings that were old when the show began, in the cemetery's oldest and most weathered headstones. In the specific way, certain parts of Springfield feel like they predate the industrial presence that now dominates the skyline. The other Springfield is there. It lives in the margins and the backgrounds. It was there before the show began, and it will be there, in implication if not in episode, when the show eventually ends. The Simpsons as an argument for paying attention. Everything that has been examined in the preceding sections, from the opening credits to the cemetery, to the chalkboard, to the couch gag, to the leitmotif system, to the writers' names in the background crowd, all of it, taken together, is an argument. Not an explicit argument, not an argument that any character in the show makes, not a thesis statement delivered in dialogue, not a moral or a lesson or a conclusion. An argument made through the practice of the show itself, through what it does and how it does it and what it rewards. The argument is, pay attention to things, not just the things that are obviously worth attention, not just the foreground, the center, the announced important content, everything, the background, the corner, the fine print, the 4-second musical phrase, the shop sign, the tombstone inscription for someone who never appeared in any episode, the mailbox on a house nobody ever enters, the product in the corner of a store shelf that has been in the same corner since 1989. All of it is worth attention. All of it has been made with the care that is owed to things that are worth attention. The show has been making the argument through its own practice, in every episode, for 36 years. This is an unusual argument for a television show to make, because television is mostly in the business of telling you what to pay attention to. Television uses the grammar of the medium framing, editing, sound design, performance to direct the viewer's attention efficiently toward the content that will deliver the desired experience most effectively. Television manages attention. It does not invite the kind of free-ranging, background-examining, shelf-reading attention that finds Easter eggs. The Simpsons does both. It manages attention in the foreground, delivering story and character and comedy through the standard grammar of the medium. And in the background, it rewards the attention that cannot be managed, the attention that drifts, that redirects, that goes looking for something that was not pointed at. Both kinds of attention are rewarded, but only one kind finds what the background has been holding since 1989. The argument for paying attention is not new. It has been made in other contexts, in other traditions, by other practices. The hidden thing that rewards close examination is an argument as old as the practice of hiding things for people to find. But The Simpsons makes this argument at a scale and a consistency that is genuinely unusual. Nearly 800 episodes, 36 years, the same commitment to making the background worth examining in every single one. The show has been making the argument longer than most of its current viewers have been alive. It will keep making it for as long as the show continues to be made. And the background in every episode will hold what it holds patiently. Specifically, in the corners nobody is required to look at. Look, anyway. That is the whole argument. That has always been the whole argument. The long history of the thing nobody was watching. There is a version of the history of The Simpsons that focuses entirely on the main story, the plots, the characters' developments, the episodes that stand out as cultural landmarks, the seasons people debate, the moments that were turned into memes and GIFs, and the shared reference points of people who grew up watching the show. That history is long and well documented and genuinely interesting. But it is not the history being told in this video. The history being told here is the history of what was happening in the corners, while everyone was watching the center. The history of the background. The history of the 36 years of specific, careful, sometimes inexplicable content that was being placed in the margins of the show while the main story was proceeding in its foreground. This history is not well documented, because the primary documents, the backgrounds themselves, require effort to examine and have historically required equipment to examine that most viewers did not have. The history of Simpsons backgrounds is the history of a body of work that was largely inaccessible to serious examination for the first decade or more of the show's existence. VHS playback allowed pausing, but degraded image quality made background text difficult to read. Laserdisc provided better quality but limited accessibility. DVD, arriving in the late 1990s and expanding through the 2000s, was the first format that made the backgrounds of The Simpsons genuinely examinable at home, clear enough, and pause-capable enough that a viewer could sit with a background frame long enough to read what was in it. The fan community's engagement with Simpsons background content tracks almost perfectly with the history of home video technology. The things being found in the 2000s were placed in backgrounds from the late 1980s and early 1990s, waiting in their corners for a decade or more for the technology that would allow their discovery to reach the majority of the show's audience. This waiting period is part of the archive's history. The Easter eggs placed in Season 3 have a history that includes the years before anyone could examine them. Years during which they existed in the background, technically present in every broadcast of the episode, technically visible to anyone looking at the right part of the screen at the right moment, but practically inaccessible to any examination more thorough than the impression of normal viewing. The content existed, but it existed without an audience. For years, some of it, for a decade or more. The cemetery inscriptions were there before anyone read them. The bookshelf jokes were composed before anyone could read them. The hospital anatomy was accurate before anyone could verify it. The content preceded its audience. This gap between creation and discovery is part of what makes The Simpsons' background tradition unusual. Most Easter eggs in modern media are placed with the expectation of near-immediate discovery. They are put in games or films or shows where the audience has tools to find them quickly, where the discovery is expected to happen within days or weeks of release. The Simpsons placed content in backgrounds in 1991 that some portion of it was not examined carefully until 2005 or later. Some content placed in the 1990s may not have been found yet. Some may never be found. The relationship between placing and finding is not the tight loop that most Easter egg traditions assume. It is a long, open-ended relationship between a production that placed things and an audience that has been slowly, over decades, discovering what was placed. Some of what was placed will be found, some will not. Some of what has been found only once, by one person, who recorded the discovery in a fan forum that no longer exists. Some of what was found was recorded, and then the record was lost. The archive is not only the content that was placed, it is the content that was placed and the content that was found, and the gap between those two sets, the things placed that have not been found, the things found that have not been documented, the things documented in places that have since disappeared. This is what 36 years of hidden content produces. Not a clean catalog, but a living, partially accessible, partially lost archive, growing at one end as new episodes are made and shrinking at another end as old records are lost, and growing again as new tools allow new examinations of old content. What the production has confirmed and what it has not. The Easter egg archive of The Simpsons exists in a condition of partial confirmation. Some hidden content has been directly acknowledged by production staff in DVD commentaries, in interviews, in statements about specific episodes. These acknowledgments are the most certain category. Content confirmed as deliberate, placed with specific intent, documented in the production's own statements. But the confirmed content is a small fraction of the total. The majority of the background details, the majority of the specific connections, the majority of the numerical patterns and the thematic correspondences that viewers have identified, none of these have been directly confirmed by the production. They exist as convincing identifications, as well-documented patterns, as connections that multiple independent observers have found without coordination, but without the production saying, yes, this was deliberate, this was the intent. This condition is not unique to The Simpsons. Most Easter egg archives in most long-running media exist in this state of partial confirmation. The production confirms what it chooses to confirm. The rest sits in the ambiguous territory between deliberate hidden content and coincidence, observed by motivated, attentive viewers. The Simpsons' particular version of this ambiguity is shaped by the show's longevity and the size of its audience. 36 years of production means an enormous number of decisions made by an enormous number of people across multiple generations of production staff. The person who placed a specific name in a background tombstone in 1993 is not necessarily available to confirm that the placement was deliberate. The background artist who furnished a hospital room with accurate anatomy in 1996 may not be reachable. The composer who built a musical quotation into an underscore Q in 2001 may have since moved on from the production. The show is too old, and has been made by too many people for the production to speak definitively about every piece of content in its backgrounds. Some things were confirmed in DVD commentaries made in the early 2000s and are now the most certain items in the archive. Some things have been confirmed more recently in the production's various social media presences, but the majority of the archive exists in the uncertainty that is the natural condition of content placed by people over many years who are no longer in a position to speak about every decision they made. This uncertainty is not a problem with the archive. It is the archive's honest condition. The hidden things were placed and found and assessed by viewers who brought their knowledge and their attention to bear on them, and the resulting identifications are as certain as they can be, given the information available. They are convincing and well documented, and consistent with the show's established practice and with what is known about its production. And some of them will remain in the category of things that might be deliberate or might be observed coincidence, and there will be no way to resolve the question definitively, and that is part of what it means to be this far into this kind of attention to a show that has been running for this long. The uncertainty is the honest answer to the question of what the archive contains. Most of it, probably yes. Some of it, possibly. Some of it, unknown. All of it worth examining. On the experience of having watched this long, the viewer who has been with The Simpsons for 30 years is in a relationship with the show that most entertainment does not produce. They have watched one thing, or one version of one thing, for an enormous portion of their life. They have aged while watching a cast of characters who have not aged. They have moved through phases of their own life, while the Simpson family remained in their specific configuration on Evergreen Terrace. This creates a specific kind of intimacy with the material. The long-term viewer carries more of the show inside them than any casual viewer does. They have accumulated without intending to, simply by watching an enormous internal archive of the show's moments, characters, running gags, callbacks, and specific episodes. They have developed reflexes specific to this show. The particular readiness for the specific kind of joke that The Simpsons makes, the familiarity with its structural rhythms, the ability to anticipate the specific shape of its emotional moments. And they have developed the background. They have, without necessarily deciding to examine backgrounds carefully, absorbed enough specific background detail across 30 years of watching to have a functional knowledge of what Springfield's regular locations look like. They have seen the Moe's back wall enough times to have an impression of what is there. They have seen the quick E-Mart shelves enough times to notice when something is different. They have heard the opening theme enough times to notice, at some level below conscious attention, when the orchestration has shifted. The long-term viewer is the audience the background was made for, not because they chose to examine backgrounds carefully, but because 30 years of watching has produced, as a byproduct of simple attention, a sufficient archive of background impressions to make deviation and connection and callback noticeable in ways that shorter relationships with the show do not support. The Easter egg tradition rewards time, not just attention, but duration. The show was made across 36 years, and the archive of hidden content it produced rewards the viewer who has been there for a significant portion of that duration. Not all of it, the viewer who arrived last year can still find things in the backgrounds. But the deepest layer of the archive, the layer of callback and cross-reference, and the long-form patterns visible only in retrospect, requires time to access. The Simpsons has been asking its audience for time since 1989. Most entertainment asks for attention. This show has been asking for time. The viewers who have given it time are the ones who have the fullest experience of what the show actually is. And the viewers who have given it time and who have also redirected some of that time's accumulated attention toward the background, those viewers are the ones the Easter egg tradition was made for. You have given it time. You are redirecting attention to the background. Welcome to the part of the archive that was waiting for you. A final word on what you are taking with you. Something changes when you watch The Simpsons with the knowledge that the backgrounds contain things. It is not a dramatic change. You do not suddenly notice every Easter egg in real time. Most of them are still invisible at normal viewing speed, still requiring the kind of frame-specific attention that normal viewing does not provide. You cannot unlearn the forward momentum of the story. The story still moves and your attention still tends to follow it. But something is different. The difference is in the periphery. When your attention drifts to the edge of a frame, when the eye moves briefly from the character who is speaking to the bookshelf behind them, or to the television in the corner, or to the billboard visible through the window, it is now drifting with awareness. With the knowledge that the thing at the edge of the frame might be worth stopping for. with the learned expectation that what is in the margin of a Simpsons scene has been placed there with as much consideration as what is in the center. That change in peripheral awareness is what watching The Simpsons with this knowledge produces. Not a different show, the same episodes, the same characters and stories and jokes, but watched with a different relationship to the frame, with the knowledge that the frame has depths that forward motion does not reveal. This is a generous thing for a show to have given its audience across 36 years. The Easter egg tradition is not just hidden content, it is a gift of depth. An expansion of the experience available in every episode you have already watched and every episode you will watch in the future. It adds something to a relationship that might otherwise have been fixed, that might have reached the point where you had seen enough to have absorbed what the show offered, and where subsequent viewing was repetition rather than discovery. The background makes repetition impossible. Every episode you watch from this point forward has something in it that you have not found yet. That might be a specific Easter egg, or it might simply be the quality of a background that, now that you are aware of it as a space of specific content, offers a different experience than it did when you were looking past it. The show has been running for 36 years. It has been placing things in its backgrounds for the same amount of time. The archive of what is there is larger than any individual viewer's attention can fully map. And it is still being added to, every episode, every season. Springfield is still there. The corners are still being furnished. The shelves are still being stocked with specific titles. The church bulletin board is still being updated. The saxophone riff will be different next week. You know where to look now. What you find is yours. Thank you for the time you spent here. If you are watching this late, or early, or somewhere in the middle of a night that is not quite sleep yet, drop your location and time in the comments. The idea of people in different time zones in the same quiet space is something worth knowing about. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring. And good night from Springfield, where the lights in the background have always been on, and where something has always been waiting in the corner you were not supposed to look at. It is glad you looked. And one more thing, the show that taught America to watch television differently. There is an argument to be made, and it is worth making here, at the end, that The Simpsons did something to American viewing culture that no other single show has done. It taught people to look at the corners. Not universally, not immediately, not in any coordinated way, but across 36 years of placing specific discoverable content in backgrounds and margins and fine print and musical textures and 4-second musical phrases that were unique every week, the show created a specific subset of its audience who developed the habit of close examination as a way of watching television. People who learned, through years of watching this show and finding things in it, that the background of a frame could be worth examining, that the margin could contain the joke, that the corner was a location worth directing attention toward. This habit transfers. The viewer who learned to read Simpsons backgrounds is also more likely to read the backgrounds of other things they watch. The viewer who learned to listen for the specific musical quotation in the underscore of a Simpsons scene is also more likely to hear the musical quotations in the underscores of other shows and films. The viewer who learned to freeze frame a Simpsons grocery store shelf and read the labels is also more likely to freeze frame the bookshelves and bulletin boards and background signage of other shows. The Simpsons taught close examination as a mode of engagement with visual media. It did this by rewarding that mode of engagement, consistently, for 36 years, in every episode, in every background. The reward was specific enough and consistent enough that the habit of close examination was not extinguished. It was reinforced, deepened, expanded. The generation of viewers who grew up watching The Simpsons in the 1990s and 2000s is a generation that was, in a specific sense, trained to pay close attention to things that were not pointing at themselves, to redirect attention from the center to the margin, to look at the thing that was not asking to be looked at. This training was not the show's stated purpose. The Simpsons was not making a media literacy program. It was making a comedy. But as a byproduct of making a comedy with 36 years of commitment to rewarding close attention in the margins, it produced something that extends beyond the comedy itself, a model for how to engage with made things that is more thorough, more curious, and more rewarding than the passive forward movement that most entertainment assumes. Look at what was placed there for someone who would look. Hear what was composed for someone who would listen. Read what was written in the fine print for someone who would read the fine print. The Simpsons spent 36 years making the case that someone would. You are the someone. The Simpsons and the art of the patient thing. Springfield has always been a patient place. Patient in the way that things built to last are patient, not waiting anxiously, not requiring immediate acknowledgement, simply present, sustained, continuing to exist in the specific form they were given and the specific form they have accumulated across the years. Patient in the way that a town that has been there longer than anyone can remember is patient. The buildings do not rush. The streets do not hurry. The cemetery does not press for attention. The things placed in the corners of frames stay in the corners of frames for years until someone comes along and notices them. This patience is the aesthetic condition of the Easter egg tradition. The thing hidden is, by definition, not asking to be found. It is available to be found. Available in the specific way that something placed in a location where it could be found but where most people would not look is available. Available to the person who looks where most people do not. Springfield has been available in this sense since 1989. The backgrounds have been waiting since the first season. The first Easter egg placed in the background of the first season that nobody has yet found is still there, still in its corner, still available to the first person who looks at that specific part of that specific frame, with sufficient attention and sufficient knowledge to understand what they are looking at. This is a kind of permanent availability that most things do not offer. Most things are found or not found in a relatively short window. They are new, they are visible, they are the object of attention, and then they are not new and the attention moves on. The thing that was not found in the window of newness becomes the thing that was not found. The Simpsons background content does not have a window of newness in this sense. It is always new to the person who has not found it yet. The grocery store shelf from Season 4 is as available to examination today as it was when the episode aired. The hospital wall from Season 7 is as examinable now as it was when the episode was produced. The cemetery inscription for the unnamed character has not degraded. The bookshelf joke is not time-limited. The patient thing waits. The attentive person arrives. The discovery happens on the attentive person's timeline, not on the production's timeline. This is different from most entertainment, which presents its content on its own timeline and asks the viewer to keep up. The background presents its content on the viewer's timeline. You find it when you find it. It is there whenever you arrive. Springfield will be there when you come back. Whatever time it is, wherever you are, however long it has been since you last watched, the backgrounds are maintained, the corners are stocked, the show is still being made, and the archive is still growing. What was hidden is still hidden. What has been found is still findable. What has not been found yet is waiting, patiently, in the specific corner where it was placed, by the specific person who placed it, for the specific kind of attention that will eventually, in its own time, arrive. Go find it. That has always been the invitation. That will always be the invitation. Springfield is patient. A last thought before the credits roll. There is one more thing worth saying, and it is the simplest thing in this entire video. The Simpsons is a show about a family. All the theories, all the Easter eggs, all the hidden content in 36 years of backgrounds and chalkboards and couch gags and musical underscore underneath all of that is a show about a family sitting on a couch. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, the same couch, the same living room, the same house, on the same street, in the same impossible town. Every episode, they end up back there. Whatever happened, whatever Springfield forgot or remembered, whatever Burns engineered, whatever Maggie observed from her patient silence, whatever Lisa said that nobody listened to, the episode ends, and the family is on the couch. The Easter egg archive is remarkable for its scale and its sustained commitment. But the most remarkable thing about the show is simpler than any of that. It is that the family is still there, 36 years later, on the same couch, in the same house. The backgrounds are stocked and the corners are furnished, and the show has been placing things in its margins for 3.5 decades. All of that is true, and underneath all of it, the show is still a family. Still the same family. Still finding their way back to the couch by the end of every episode, in a town that is impossible and a world that does not quite make sense, and sitting down together anyway. The Easter egg hidden in the whole thing, in all 36 years of it, is that a family, a couch, a home to come back to. Whatever time it is where you are, good night.